Chapter 1, Stone-Faced One, Jail Bird. Chapter text guest of the state. The nightmare began to repeat again. I'd lost track of how many times it had played already. I was bound in a ritual circle, the first girl I'd ever loved barely looking at me as she painted runes on my skin. Not far away, but out of the circle, my mentor, a man I didn't exactly like but had thought I could trust, was preparing for whatever they were about to do to me. In the memory, or whatever this nightmare was, the walls of our rented house in the London suburbs faded away into smoke and darkness. All I could focus on was whatever they were trying to do to me, and the rest of the world was darkness. All I could feel was cold. As the old man who'd rescued me from the orphanage and taught me magic began to chant, something began to pull away from the background. Made of the same black smoke, it gradually took on the vague form of a person. "I have prepared the vessel as promised. Claim him," Justin shouted, as the wraith began to move toward me and the runes blazed. Pain seared through me, and the walls of my mind started to crumble. I shouted for Elaine to help, but she had retreated to the back of the room, her glassy stare on the floor. The creature reached out its arm and touched me, causing me torment I'd never felt before. It was up to me. Bound and without a focus, the trick my godmother had taught me was extremely risky, but not as risky as whatever this spectre wanted to do to me. With a painful twist and a thunderous clap, I was across the room, hands free and grabbing for my blasting rod, discarded by Justin in the corner by my clothes. My blood was now freely mixing into the runes. Random strips of flesh splinched off and drifting to the floor back in the circle, along with the ropes that held me. It hurt, but not as much as Justin and Elaine immediately trying to react, to bind me back into the circle for this creature. I dove behind the couch that had been shoved away to turn the sitting room into a ritual space. In the nightmare, pieces of the room were materializing from the shadows as they became relevant. I hit the floor hard, dust burning into my wounds, but narrowly dodging the red light of stunners flying toward me. I didn't know how I was going to fight both of them and this spirit. I'd never even beaten Justin dueling by himself. My only hope, I thought, was to try to apparate again, even though going 10 feet hadn't worked out so well, and my blasting rod wouldn't help. Out of the house, and I'd have a chance. But then the wraith floated above the couch, soaking up all thought and light in the room as it sought to finish whatever it had started. The very wrongness of it woke a powerful anger in me, and I could only think back to the other spell my godmother had so recently taught me, which the rod was basically designed for. Incendio, paro incendio. I screamed and willed my fear and betrayal into the charm, transforming it into a powerful curse. The purple jet of flame barely shed any light, reserving all of its power for scorching heat. When it had happened, it was the hottest thing I'd ever felt, but in this nightmare memory, it barely registered against the cold. I caught the wraith with the blast, and it flung itself away with a shriek, fleeing the room with a hole torn in its nebulous form. I tried to end the spell, but it had taken on a life of its own, flame still shooting from my focus, even when I dropped the blasting rod. I had no idea where it was still getting its power, but the borders of the room were going from nebulous void to intense, colorful flames. As I peeked over the couch, I was shocked by what the flames had become. Coalesced into a beast of near-ultraviolet fire, it had already torn into Justin. I didn't even know if he'd had long enough to realize what was happening. His smoking corpse had fallen not far from where he'd attacked me. I couldn't see Elaine through the smoke and flame. I was about to charge into the burning house looking for her when something changed. The burning house slowly faded into a stone cell, and the numbing cold became simply the clammy chill of a damp prison room. As I came out of my fugue, or dream, or whatever it was, I thought I saw the wraith that attacked me retreat down the hall as a big-eared cat made of silver light stalked past the door. As the lambent glow hit me, I was beginning to come out of whatever terrible fugue I'd been in. "Did you even interrogate the boy before you brought him here?" a deep voice asked. A raspier voice answered, "Interrogations always go easier after they know what they're in for." I couldn't see the speaker, but I was sure he was smirking. "Besides, he's an aura killer. Trial's just a formality at this point." "A formality we must uphold," answered the first voice, who I could now see was a dark-skinned man in robes styled to look like some kind of African formal costume. He gestured at the door while keeping his wand pointed down the hall, controlling the silver links. Patronus my memory finally supplied. The spell used to ward off creatures of darkness. I wonder if that would have been a better choice for me than FiendFyre. The other man slouched over and grudgingly unlocked the cell door with his wand. Between the ratty tan trench coat and the graying blonde hair, he looked like a guy that had read a Hellblazer comic and decided that was exactly the vibe he wanted to put out. Hell, he looked old enough that maybe Constantine's dress code was based on this guy by an incompletely memory-wiped comic artist. Come on, punk. Time for your interview. I thought about being petulant and making them drag me out, but I needed the time away from whatever nightmare-inducing creature that was, and could barely put together a coherent thought of resistance. When we came to London, Justin had warned me the British prison system was harsh, but this just seemed wrong. I grudgingly levered myself standing and had a bit of schadenfreude as the men did a double take when they realized I towered over them. I'm not exactly physically overwhelming, especially given how I'm thin enough to read as all elbows and knees, but the only guys taller than me tend to have a giant in their family trees. As I followed them out the narrow corridor, the rows of cells lit only by the light from the Patronus, I couldn't see anyone else in the nearby cells, but I could hear screams of anguish and terror somewhere below me. We finally left through another gate at the end of the hall where some candles were burning. As the gate was closed on the room, I saw that the sign above said, Wing 1, minimum security. The wannabe Constantine caught my glance and smirked. That's right. You only got a taste. Once the Wisengamot nails you for killing Dumorn, you're going down into maximum security with the Death Eaters. Of the three proper nouns in that sentence, the only one I recognized was Dumorn. It was Justin's last name, and meant I was probably screwed. Good cop, bad cop. My name is Harry Blackstone Copperfield Dresden. Conjure by it at your own risk. Admittedly, when I practiced that in the mirror I was full of confidence and staring down an imagined bad guy, not still out of it in a candlelit interrogation room in some drafty old castle, and sitting across an antique table from a couple of auras. The trench-coat-wearing Hardas seemed amused rather than intimidated. The black guy actually blinked for a second and tilted his head, like he'd heard my name before. Why'd I want to conjure by your name? One of you is too many as it is, my interrogator quipped as he slouched deeper into his coat. He's obviously too deep into Dementor exposure to be coherent, Dawlish, the other one explained, then got up to head out of the room. I'll be right back. Clearly pleased that his partner had left the room, Dawlish took the opportunity for another pass at breaking me. You're a cop killer, Dresden. Dumorn taught me. Taught a lot of the auras at the academy. Lot of auras ready to see some payback for burning the man alive. American out of your depth in London. Hope to find something in the house to steal. I tried to chuckle sardonically, but whatever those cells had done to me turned it into a cough. I managed to get out. Was shield practice for you baseballs? Or are those just easier to come by in the States? That hit home and Dawlish shrugged. Bludgers. Justin had apparently been a violent teacher with his earlier apprentices too. He insisted that any idiot could make a shield that would stop a spell, but most wizards never learned to protect against bullets or other flung missiles. The aging aura was looking at me differently now. You claiming you were his apprentice? Something like that, I shrugged. I was going to elaborate, but the gesture made me wince. I looked down at my arm, pulling up the prison jumpsuit they'd given me. My splinching wounds were scabbed over, but far from healed. At least I hadn't bled to death. Only the highest quality Dittany salve for the minister's special guests, Dawlish said, the sarcasm dripping. That's how we found you, you know. Barely took a tracking spell to follow the amount of blood you were losing. How'd you splint yourself anyway? I winced. Hopefully they hadn't followed my whole trip after leaving the burning house behind. I'd stashed some rescued items I hoped to retrieve if I got out of this. I didn't exactly get the impression he'd believe me, but no reason not to share. Apparating out of the ritual circle I was stuck in. The other aura had walked back in on that, bringing a half-eaten candy bar that he handed to me as he sat back down. Eat that, he suggested. It will help. While I was suspicious, I also suddenly realized I was starving. How long had I been here? The chocolate wasn't exactly a meal, but I did feel a lot better as soon as I started eating it. A grey fog I'd been feeling around my senses and emotions started to dissipate. You get that last bit, Shacklebolt? His partner asked. Shacklebolt nodded. A shame the FiendFyre destroyed any proof one way or the other. But let's play this out. Start at the beginning, please, Mr. Dresden. If it had just been that guy, I might have. But I was alone in a foreign country. My mentor had tried to use me as a sacrifice in some dark arts ritual. My girlfriend had helped, and Dawlish was at best as misguided as I'd been. At worst, he knew my former mentor was dark and was trying to cover it up. The chocolate had at least cleared my head enough to start asking the real questions. I'd love to, but do I get a lawyer or a phone call in this country? Not that I had anyone to call. Dawlish looked over at Shacklebolt and asked, "Why do the American mudbloods always ask for a phone?" The Black Aura didn't particularly seem to like the insult, which Justin had warned me was a slur about blood purity that many British wizards used. "It's a cliché in Muggle films," he allowed, then turned to me to explain. "We must inform your barrister if you have one on retainer, and you will have additional opportunities to contact one before a trial. But as Aura Dawlish has made clear, we can hold you for quite some time when you are the primary suspect in a murder investigation before bringing it to trial. If you have a compelling story, it's often a good idea to just tell us what happened. We may be able to use your testimony to identify a better suspect. Right now, you're our only known witness to what happened last night. I hadn't found Elaine in the house. She tied me up and helped with the ritual. She betrayed me even more fully than Justin because I thought she loved me. It would be so easy to just blame her for everything, see if they could find her. But for all I knew, she was dead. Even if she was, I couldn't bring myself to claim she was the mastermind and Justin was a victim. I still felt I owed her that for some reason. So I started talking, figuring out how much I was going to say as I went. Not that it matters, but I'm not a mudblood, I began, fixing my gaze on Dawlish. My mother was magical and probably British. I thought we had moved to London to try to learn more about her. She died when I was born. My father died when I was little. Justin found me in an orphanage before I turned 11, told me I was a wizard. Something about the age captured Shacklebolt attention. An American Muggle orphanage. I nodded and he asked, "Why there? And how did Dumorn find you?" Dad traveled for work. He was a Muggle magician. They do tricks for entertainment. I'm not sure where he met Mom. I don't know how Justin found me. He led me to believe that it was normal for wizards to find kids strong in magic and take them on as apprentices. Is that wrong? This is such bollocks, Dawlish insisted, interrupting his partner trying to answer. Justin Dumorn was a decorated Aura and Academy instructor who retired after the war with nearly half a century of service. Why would he be trawling Macusa territory for apprentices? Shacklebolt thought for a moment, then asked me, "When and how did you get into Britain, Mr. Dresden?" It was easy enough to dredge up the date, since I'd made a joke about bewaring the Ides of March when we came over. March 15th this year. International portkey from Chicago to London. Some of our furniture and clothes got shipped the Muggle way to the house. And we'll find that you and Dumorn traveled together. Me, Justin, and Elaine, but I didn't need to volunteer that. As I nodded again, Shacklebolt continued, "Then we'll confirm the passports and travel with the ministry tomorrow. But for now, can we take for granted that, whatever the reason, Mr. Dresden was Dumorn's apprentice?" Now it was Dawlish's turn to nod, grudgingly. "Please continue, Mr. Dresden." While I was vaguely aware that I was experiencing the good cop, bad cop gambit, it was a classic for a reason, because it worked. He trained me for a few years. Like I said, we were here as far as I knew to look for information about my mother. We talked about it over Christmas. It was going to be my present. We came over in March and didn't make any progress for months. I don't know anymore if we were actually here looking for my mother. Did you have contact with Dumorn in the last 5 years or so? Shacklebolt asked his partner. Dawlish just shook his head, clearly annoyed that my story was holding up so far. "Why don't you think you were looking for your mother?" I didn't think they wanted to hear that my mad godmother had warned me, and I'd still walked back into the trap like an idiot. Instead, I just offered the far more lame. He got distant. He'd go talk to people that he didn't want me to meet and wouldn't have any answers. Just said he was working on it. Felt like he was working on something else. Shacklebolt took that opening, looked at me, raised an eyebrow at Dawlish, and then asked, "Did he ever mention Gringotts?" Before I could even answer, Dawlish actually sat up from his slouch. now annoyed at his partner. No, we are not entertaining the idea that my friend and teacher was involved in that, especially because he was getting murdered by this punk on the same night. By Mr. Dresden, or by co-conspirators who had a falling out after a botched robbery and wanted to hide the evidence. Screw you, Shaq. Don't ruin my case in front of the suspect. Dawlish actually stood up to try to get a height advantage over his partner, his rickety old wooden chair toppling over in his haste. You can make up all the conspiracy stories you want and sell them to the quibbler, but I have a dead, decorated aura and an American half-blood with no alibi leaving a blood trail right to his door. Black Aura didn't lose his cool, just leaned back a bit so he could keep me and Dawlish both in view. And I have an unprecedented heist on the same night as a violent confrontation using dark magic, only 30 miles away. You know, I don't believe in coincidences, John. If your teacher was involved, Mr. Dresden is now our best lead, no matter how much you want to throw him to the Dementors because a friend of yours is dead. I was suddenly wishing I hadn't mentioned the ritual circle. At this point, they were ready to assume Justin had been involved in some kind of conspiracy that got him killed. Maybe he had. From what my godmother had told me and what he'd tried, very little would surprise me. I did suddenly remember something from my potions lessons, so before they went after each other again I interjected, "Can't you just put me on Veritaserum?" Shacklebolt gestured at me as if he'd scored a point. Probably guilty people didn't ask to take truth serum. Dawlish grimaced and asked, "How old are you?" "I'll be 16 in October," I admitted. He shook his head, a bit of perverse glee slipping back in. "We can only use it on minors in extreme circumstances. Bad for your magic. We'll have to use other interrogation techniques." His partner countered, "If it gets him out of Azkaban for murdering an aura, that may be an extreme enough circumstance. And if he's willing to take Veritaserum, he's probably willing to submit to mind reading." Dawlish shot back. "Even if we had a Legilimens here, he'd need a guardian's permission. Since he admits that he's an orphan and his mentor was just murdered, we don't even know who that is." Suddenly, from outside the room, there was a sound like a barrel of gasoline igniting and a pressure wave of warm air that shook the decrepit old door and made the candles in the room flicker. Shacklebolt grinned. Perfect timing. I have a solution to both problems. On wings of flame, Shacklebolt got up to invite in his guest, while Dawlish's face went all squinty, as if he suddenly realized he'd been outplayed. I don't know what I was expecting, but what I got was Gandalf, if he'd entered our world through Elton John's closet. I wasn't sure if the powder blue robes stitched with golden and silver stars were his pajamas, since they looked rumpled as if he'd slept in them or put them on quickly to get here in the middle of the night. They were an interesting contrast to the bright red and orange, hawk-sized bird sitting on his shoulder. Shacklebolt gestured to his own recently vacated chair and said, "Chief Warlock, it's a pleasure to see you this evening. We're hoping you can solve an issue. Mr. Dresden here is a suspect in a murder too young for Veritaserum, and it's unclear who his magical guardian is to allow for other methods of interrogation." The white-bearded old wizard made a negating gesture with his hand about taking Shacklabolt's chair, and effortlessly conjured a much nicer, plush chair at the end of the table with a wave of his wand. I noticed that wand was decorated and carved in a way that would be extremely difficult from everything I knew about focus crafting, and looked ancient. The old man quirked an eyebrow as he noticed me examining his wand rather than his conjuration, and quickly hid the wand back up his sleeve in one smooth motion while he was sitting down. As Shacklebolt reclaimed his seat between his guest and Dawlish, the chief warlock recited, "Mr. H. Dresden, the East Bunk Room, Mercy Home, Chicago, Illinois. I forget the exact street address." He admitted, "It was with great dismay that we did not receive a response to your Hogwarts acceptance letter several years ago, and even greater dismay when we learned that you had been adopted from the home and moved immediately before receiving it. Despite serious efforts to locate you, we could not determine where you'd moved. It's much harder for the locating charms to work in America, of course, but I always suspected something else was at work." Dawlish wasn't buying it. Would an American half-blood get a Hogwarts letter? I hated to agree with the Constantine wannabe, but I added, "Isn't that the dueling school for English purebloods? It's far more than that, Mr. Dresden, and through your mother's line, you're a legacy student at the top of the list for admittance." As if to head off questions about my mother, he added, "But where are my manners? I'm Albus Dumbledore, and I'm headmaster of Hogwarts, in addition to the chief warlock title that Kingsley mentioned." He glanced at Dawlish. "Since you never technically declined your letter due to extenuating circumstances, and you have no other clearly identified magical guardian, I think I can act in loco parentis for you sufficiently to approve other methods of interrogation, as Kingsley suggested." He succeeded in derailing my questions, as my admittedly weak command of Latin finally turned up a possible translation of the word Dawlish had used earlier: mind collecting. Dumbledore sat back in a way that let the candlelight glimmer off his glasses and make his eyes seem to twinkle in approval. "Close, Mr. Dresden. The traditional translation of legilimency is mind reading, but there's definitely an element of collecting a subject's thoughts involved. In most cases, it is an entirely painless process, where I view your memories in order to establish what happened." He shot a disapproving look at Dawlish. "Is generally a preferred option of establishing innocence to being thrown in with the Dementors." He made a good point. I didn't trust the old man or his too convenient arrival. I definitely didn't want him digging around my head. But if it was that or going back in a cell, do it. Dawlish still looked like he was trying to come up with a legal objection when Dumbledore told me, "Please bring your memories of the night in question to the front of your mind and look me in the eyes." Legilimens. Once again, the nightmare of the previous evening raced through my head, but it was less like I was stuck experiencing it again, and more like I was visualizing it to explain it to someone else. And there were weird tangents. Looking at Justin brought forth short digressions about how I'd met him and my last few years of training. Looking at Elaine started me thinking about her, but it was far too painful, and I resisted. Dumbledore probably could have kept going despite my efforts, but I felt him pull back and return to the memory. When we reached the part where the wraith appeared, I felt a surge of surprise and worry that I didn't think was coming from me. All the memories I had of anything similar, from horror movies to the Dementor I'd seen earlier, flitted through my mind's eye and didn't find a match. He let the rest of the memory play out quickly, ending, thankfully, as I raced into the house looking for Elaine. While I blinked and tried to get my brain back in order after that experience, Dumbledore leaned back in his cushioned chair and steepled his fingers, deep in thought. Dawlish clearly didn't want to give him too much time to think, and asked, "Well?" With a sigh of annoyance at the interruption, Dumbledore allowed, "Mr. Dresden is not a murderer, John." I know Justin was well respected amongst many of the auras that he trained, but I suggest you set aside that preconception and do some digging into his activities of the last few years. "Was he involved in the other incident last night?" Shacklebolt asked. "Not that Mr. Dresden could prove, but I suspect if Justin was not involved, he knew people that were." Dumbledore sighed. "Pulling at that thread may at least turn up some new leads for your investigation." "If Dresden didn't kill Dumorn, who did?" Dawlish insisted. "I'm afraid that Justin was engaged in dangerous rituals that led inevitably to his death. While I have some suspicions as to what he hoped to achieve, Mr. Dresden did not know enough about what he saw to provide certainty. I will need to research before I'm comfortable saying more than that." I was shocked that Dumbledore wasn't revealing that I summoned the FiendFyre that killed Justin and burned down the house. I was hoping for him pointing out it was self-defense, but shocked that he was trying to make it sound like I was completely innocent. What was this old man's game? Dawlish apparently agreed and nearly yelled, "Not good enough, you old meddler. I'm sick of you coming in here and wandering off with clues and suspects. When's the last time you actually helped with an investigation?" I can think of half a dozen cases off the top of my head that are still open because you know what's going on but won't tell us. Dumbledore didn't appear to be interested in responding, so Dawlish continued, "Fuck it. I'm invoking the Damocles statute." Shacklebolt gasped, "John, nobody's called for the Doom of Damocles since Grindelwald's War." "But it's my prerogative, right?" Dawlish insisted. "Suspect that can't be conclusively exonerated of high crimes, but can't be convicted either. You can't tell me it doesn't fit. I'm invoking it. Harry Blackstone Copperfield, Dresden, you are hereby notified that, pursuant to the Damocles Statute of the High Crimes Act of 1645, until you are proven innocent of the death of Justin Dumorn, you are under the doom." Dumbledore and Shacklebolt looked pissed but weren't elaborating, so I asked, What does that mean? You mentioned American baseball, right? Dawlish elaborated with quiet glee. You've got one strike left. Keep your nose clean, punk. The next time you slip up, you're mine. The morning after, I woke up in a much better situation than the last time I'd come to. It took me a minute to remember why I was in a small castle hospital that would have looked obsolete by 1900. I guessed cleaning magic could account for a lot of problems, but if this was a muggle hospital, people would be getting infections constantly. The view was nice, at least, sunlight reflecting off the large lake below indicating that I'd been out for most of the morning, and it at least smelled clean, if not antiseptic. Dumbledore had calmly put off most of my questions the night before, other than affirming, "Wait, is that a phoenix?" when the bird in question burst into flame and apparated us from the prison to wherever I was now. I assumed Hogwarts, but so far I'd only seen this hospital room. An elderly matron, who seemed to regard herself queen of this domain, had briefly conferred with the headmaster, showed me a bed, and made me drink a potion. By the taste and effects, I was guessing a dreamless sleep draught. "Well, good morning, Mr. Dresden," the lady in question called, moving about the room in a manner that the verb bustling had been coined to describe. She'd been across the room, bottles and boxes piled on several chairs outside a large closet, likely in the middle of summer inventory. She wandered over to me and started doing diagnostic spells with her wand, while I looked on in bemusement, the school nurse stereotype come to life. "You seem to be recovering, though I insist you take it easy for a few days. I'm afraid to say that you'll likely retain some faint scarring from your improperly treated splinching wounds, but it looks like you've already bounced back from the Dementor exposure. How do you feel?" I checked my forearms and agreed that it was a significant improvement, with the angry scabs I'd had replaced with fading lines. Justin had never been interested in healing charms, not to mention some early problems at the orphanage, so they wouldn't be my first scars. I no longer felt the haze of depression and fear that lingered throughout the prison, so I guessed whatever those creatures had done to me was passing as well. "Much better, thank you, ma'am." "Excellent. I'll inform the headmaster that you're up and around. Please stay in bed until someone comes to collect you." With that, she went back to what she was doing and left me to reflect on the chaos of the last few days while looking out over the lake. I was now wearing a cotton hospital gown instead of prison robes, though I could faintly feel magic running through them as if they'd been transfigured from what I was wearing when I walked in. Curious and with nothing better to do, I gathered my magic for a few minutes and then muttered, "Finite." The surge of cancellation snapped through my clothing, and in a moment I was back in the t-shirt and shorts I'd managed to salvage from the fire and collected before leaving the prison. The transfiguration had at least worked out most of the smoke smell, but the shirt was still emblazoned with a now completely inappropriate logo for Badderbrow. Well, maybe not completely. Dumbledore had been amused that the beer's logo looked like a phoenix. Of course, I was never that precise without a focus, and the counterspell also caught the bed I was laying in. I noticed too late that the rest of the beds in the ward would only be roomy for small children, as my legs were suddenly sticking off the end of the cot. I grumbled and pulled them Indian style, so I could barely fit on the bed that had clearly been lengthened to fit me. 5 points to. "Well, we don't know what house you are yet," said the woman that had just walked in. Or that was what I thought she'd said, through her thick Scottish accent. I glanced over and was impressed. This lady could rule the Chicago goth scene by just walking into a club. Given how long witches and wizards lived, the combination of barely graying dark hair and fine wrinkles could put her at anywhere from 50 to 100. Severely dressed in all black with a witch's hat, perhaps her lack of wrinkles was due to never smiling, though I thought I spotted a number of emotions flickering around her eyes as she looked at me. 5 points, I asked, confused. "Our scoring system for student achievements," she explained. "Once one gets into the habit, it becomes a reflex. That's the first wandless counterspell I've seen from a student in some time." I shrugged. I was never very good with a wand as a focus. I'm much better with the right tool than a Swiss Army knife. Since you can't always get the right focus, I learned to do most charms without one if I need to. Her mouth puckered a bit, and I wasn't sure if she was upset or impressed. "Well, that may make it harder to teach you here. We haven't taught anything but wand magic for decades. I wasn't sure there were any serious practitioners of other styles still in the Western world. This certainly makes your placement tests much more important. I felt like I needed to throw the brakes on this whole educational train before it got too much momentum. Ma'am, I really appreciate the headmaster sticking his neck out for me to keep me from being railroaded by the auras. But I barely heard of Hogwarts before last night, and I certainly can't pay for a fancy Scottish boarding school for purebloods. I was honestly hoping that the US Embassy would ship me back home to Chicago so I could get a job and try to pick up my Jed. She cocked her head like a confused animal, then admitted, "I'm not exactly sure what a Jed is, Mr. Dresden, but there are difficulties with your plan. Mainly that it won't be permitted for you to leave the country until we can convince the ministry to lift the Doom of Damocles. While using Muggle means might succeed, the Auras do keep an eye on flight and ship manifests, so it's far from guaranteed. However, I can assure you that this is not simply a school for the pure-blooded elite, no matter how much they'd like others to think so. We have many students here on scholarship, including quite a few Muggle-born. The headmaster has assured me that arranging your tuition will be a priority, as long as you're willing to put in the work." I made a guess. My mother went here. A flicker of pain, quickly concealed. None of the adults here seemed to want to be completely honest with me. She did. Several of her own ancestors did so as well. Margaret was a willful girl and left here early and not on the best of terms. Like her son, she was eager to make her own way, perhaps to her own detriment. I simply ask that you give me an opportunity to prove to you that it's worth your time. Her life might have gone much differently had she stayed at Hogwarts. I wasn't even trying to be horrible, it just slipped out. She wouldn't have married a Muggle, died in childbirth, and lost her son in the American orphanage system, you mean? I apparently wasn't ready to hear my mother, who my father had always told me was the most wonderful woman in the world, described as basically a delinquent high school dropout. The woman's face went even more still than before, as if it was taking all of her skill, being a taciturn school mom, from reacting. But I thought I saw a glimmer of tears in the corner of her eyes. Finally, after a long moment, she answered, something like that. "Will you come with me to my office so we can discuss your placement exams, Mr. Dresden?" As I followed her out, I caught a look of concern from the school nurse at the both of us, and a whispered, "Oh, Minerva." Chapter 2, Stone Face 2, Starborn. Chapter text: wearing hats. Everyone in the British wizarding world seemed to expect you to know who they were or figure it out from context, so I'd finally identified Minerva McGonagall from the nameplate on her office door. This also informed me that she was the Transfiguration professor and the assistant headmistress. The inside of the office was as severe as the rest of her demeanor. Basically a stone closet with a large fireplace and window overlooking the castle grounds. There was not much here other than a small, uncluttered desk, a couple of chairs, and a large, orderly bookshelf. The one thing that stood out was a battered old hat lying on the desk, barely still pointy in the wizarding style. "Recent upgrade?" I asked, gesturing at the much newer witch hat she was wearing. "Oh no, that's for you, Mr. Dresden." Looked like the whole scholarship student thing was about to be brought home. "I don't really wear hats," I demurred. Her cheek twitched as she sat down and gestured for me to take the chair across the desk. That might have been the closest thing to a smile that would crack through her facade. "You only have to wear it for a minute. I mentioned houses to you before. The students of Hogwarts are sorted based on temperament into one of 4 groups. The magic of that hat gauges which would suit you best. Normally, this is done on the first day of school in front of all your peers, but I assumed you would prefer not to sit on a stool in between a pair of 11-year-olds at the welcoming feast next month. I don't know, maybe that would set people's expectations of me at the right level." I was still upset about the whole situation, but I felt bad for almost making the stone-faced witch cry earlier and was willing to meet her halfway if she was back in a joking mood. I just put it on. She nodded, so I put the decrepit old hat on my head and thought I felt it wriggle on its own to settle itself. A sensation similar to what Dumbledore had done to me the night before crept over my mind, but where he was looking at my memories almost like a real-time film reel. Whatever the hat was doing seemed far faster and more thorough. I couldn't figure out why they used such a powerful artifact for arbitrarily dividing children into peer groups when the Aura Corps had to send away for their chief warlock to do a fraction of the same work. After only a moment, I heard a gravelly voice speaking in my mind. As usual, when I have to do a late sorting, I find something to recommend you to any of the houses. This may be difficult. Make your best attempt, Hat. I thought at it. I don't know anything about it. Then let me give you a brief overview. Slytherin is the house for the ambitious and cunning, and you're clever enough to make your way there. I fear, however, you might find it hard to belong with the current attitudes of the house. Ravenclaw keeps the seekers of knowledge for knowledge's sake, and you have a questing mind and deep interest in magical theory. Yet, I do not think you'd have the patience to solve a riddle every time you wanted to enter your common room. Hufflepuff is the home of the loyal, and would go out of their way to welcome you. Many orphans find their way there, but you are unlikely to be content as just one small part of a larger team. Gryffindor is the house of the brave, and you certainly have that quality to an almost foolhardy degree. Indeed, I see that you're exactly the type to make a bad quip and take another hit than to ever bend before evil. I almost hate to put you in with others that will only encourage this habit, but better be Gryffindor. That last seemed to leave my head and be announced to the room, removing the option for me to tell McGonagall that it had said Hufflepuff, where I could keep my head down. Was that pride in the professor's eyes as she gestured for me to put the hat back on the desk? Once it was back in place, and I'd run my fingers over a scalp that definitely needed a shower, but at least wouldn't have hat hair, she explained. In addition to my other duties, I serve as head of house for Gryffindor. I am to be your first point of contact for school issues. Do they even let you sleep? I asked, considering how many hats she must wear on a daily basis. Strictly on the weekends and school holidays, Mr. Dresden. I was getting it. Bad jokes were my shield against the world, and a stoic mien was hers. But Professor McGonagall was probably a fun person to be around if you could stay on her good side and get her to relax a bit. She passed a piece of paper to me. Wait, no, it was legitimately a sheet of parchment. PETA would have a field day with this place if they realized the wizarding world was still on the sheepskin standard. That's the Hogwarts course list. I'd like you to let me know the generalities of your education in each of those disciplines so we can prepare the other professors for your placement exams. A couple of things immediately jumped out to me as weird. Arithmancy covers spell creation and modification. How much math is actually taught? Do you have any social studies other than history? Wait, is there really no English class? No Latin, music, science? McGonagall let out a long-suffering sigh, then explained, that was almost verbatim the questions a pair of dentists recently asked me when reviewing the curriculum for their daughter. I assume you were taking Muggle schooling with your mentor teaching you magic. More or less, I admitted. I did a lot of home schooling, particularly after we moved here earlier in the year. That's why I wasn't too worried about getting my JED. Sorry, General. Equivalency Diploma. I think that's what it stands for. It's what you can get in the US, so you can go to college if you didn't finish high school. She nodded. That type of education is typical for most magical students elsewhere in Britain as well. The majority of witches and wizards are apprenticed in a similar manner as you were, taking their magical education from their parents or from a mentor in the trade they hope to pursue. Still others attend schools arranged for the purpose in various cities around the country. I believe one in central London even has more students than Hogwarts, which only takes up to 40 students per year group. Those schools also cover more Muggle subjects. Any such students are allowed to take the two large tests of magical aptitude, the Owls and Newts. It is extremely uncommon for anyone from an apprenticeship or smaller school to do well enough on these tests to qualify for a position in the ministry. A fair number qualify as auras and healers due to some academies specifically created to ensure specialized training for those jobs. But the vast majority are partially trained in magic and must content themselves in trades. They'll never qualify for work in the magical government. I thought I followed her. So they'll never get a chance to change the laws, making them second-class citizens. Meanwhile, Hogwarts teaches specifically to those tests. I was a bit more politic with the parents of an 11-year-old, but essentially, yes. But you have it backwards. The test is actually based on the Hogwarts curriculum as the oldest magic school in the country. Unfortunately, at this point, it's a self-reinforcing cycle. We set the standards, but are now trapped by them. And they haven't changed meaningfully in centuries. I would love to offer a larger range of classes, but the more we add to the curriculum, the less time the students have to prepare for what's on the tests. Suddenly, a lot of Justin's behaviors hit me, and I concluded most of the government, who controls these standards, entered from Hogwarts, and none of their co-workers are likely to call them on what they don't know. Meanwhile, their bosses were born in the 1800s anyway, because wizards live so long and haven't kept up with the last century of technology. So they can't go out into the rest of the world without being completely confused and scared by what they see there. She just sighed and nodded. That is, in fact, quite a succinct description of the recent conflicts in British wizarding society. If you have the time around your other classes, we're quite happy to help you take correspondence courses to maintain the other disciplines you feel are lacking. Still, though, I couldn't stop arguing, no literature or Latin courses. British schools have been mad for those for centuries. Hogwarts was founded so long ago that there was significantly less English literary tradition, and the classes were originally taught in Latin. As the language died slowly, nobody ever realized it now needed to be its own class to understand spell phrases. Professor Vector has to do a significant remedial Latin module for starting arithmancy students before they can begin to understand the spells they're creating. I felt like I was already getting good at reading this woman, despite her dislike of making facial expressions, and the feeling I was getting mirrored the deep frustration of several other teachers I'd met that felt hamstrung by government standards. "I'll just go over this list then." Her response was extremely dry. "That would be excellent. Thank you, Mr. Dresden." Forest for the trees, the next couple of days were a strange dance of getting me situated. Despite McGonagall's protests, Hogwarts was not really prepared for a penniless 15-year-old with unusual training to show up to school a month early with nothing but the clothes on his back. My corner of the fifth-year boys' room in Gryffindor Tower had become highly thrift shop chic, with all the school supplies that had been dug up from the school's lost and found. Each of the other 4 beds in the room anchored a handful of belongings left behind for the summer by their occupants, and I was grateful that nothing indicated my dorm mates were going to be snobby purebloods obsessed with new clothes. At least my second-hand robes had been retailored to mostly fit me. When I'd first gotten them, I had a substantial amount of wrist and ankle escaping. Clothes and the like were the least of my supply issues, however. "While I'm sure it's not your preferred method, I think we can find you a suitable wand to at least demonstrate competency," McGonagall insisted. I knew that wouldn't work. Magically speaking, I was the asshole that you would never trust to drive your Porsche without burning out the gearbox, but who could do all kinds of tricks in a diesel-engined pickup. But I failed to come up with a metaphor that would work for a witch without a lot of experience of technology. I just tried to explain it as, Justin tried to teach me wands starting out, and I burned out every one he handed me. Magically, I'm a clumsy brute. She clearly didn't believe me, but equally didn't want to see me break an expensive wand if I wasn't exaggerating. I've never heard of such a thing. Albus uses a wand without issue, and he's the most powerful wizard I know of. When I just shrugged, she allowed, "Perhaps he'll have some insight." After a brief flu call to the headmaster, one of the most confusing things entering magical society was their love of using fireplaces for communication and transport. He stepped through into McGonagall's office. The other night's outfit was apparently not pajamas, as today's was an equally flamboyant violet and emerald moons ensemble. "I hear you have a problem with controlling your wand, my boy," he winked. I still wasn't over how he kept quiet about what he'd seen in my head and seemed to be avoiding any chance of giving me answers. So perhaps I was a bit too forward with my retort that, "I hear many witches prefer a big staff to a well-controlled wand." McGonagall made a small, irritated intake of breath that let me know I'd be in trouble later, but Dumbledore merely grinned. That was certainly true in history, if not so much recently. He set what looked like a slightly oversized cigar box on McGonagall's desk and flipped it open to reveal that it was packed full of wands. Most of them were heavily scratched and dinged up. See if you can find one that feels compatible. All of these are at the end of their practical service, so it's no hardship if you destroy one in the testing. This wasn't the first time I'd done such an exercise, and I had a good feel for foci after learning to make my own. It didn't take long for me to select one with a reasonably close resonance to my own magic. I held it in my right hand and pushed a trickle of power through it as proof, causing it to emit orange sparks. Excellent. Perhaps a simple wand lighting charm to start, the headmaster suggested. I nodded and tried to be gentle, wordlessly casting the light spell into the wand. The tip burst into brilliant white light that was painful to look at directly. It also flickered alarmingly, like a spotlight on a transformer about to blow. Within a couple of seconds, I thought I was about to lose it and cancelled the spell. Very interesting. I have a suspicion, perhaps the levitation charm. He produced a paisley handkerchief from a pocket and dropped it on the floor between us and the door. I knew what he was getting at and got out of the chair, pushing it away from the handkerchief. Wingardium Leviosa. I swished. I flicked. There was a simultaneous snapping and ripping sound as the wand shattered into splinters that disturbed the paisley-colored snow that floated in the air above where the handkerchief once was. That's pretty normal, I admitted. Sorry about your handkerchief. Quite all right, my boy, he allowed. Minerva, perhaps I can shed some light on the situation. You see, Mr. Dresden isn't exactly unusual. It's just that wizards or witches of his temperament don't tend to make it to Hogwarts or fail out quickly due to not taking to wands. Reports are that one of the incoming students, Mr. Finnegan, is likely to be a risk case of this kind. So he needs remedial wand-handling classes, she asked. Dumbledore shook his head. If he was 11, and this was a mild problem, it might be correctable, but would also permanently handicap him as a wizard. Consider an analogy of wands as delicate rapiers. You would struggle to find an expert sword fighter who was not a master of the rapier. Yet imagine handing one to our large friend, Hagrid. Does the fact that he tends to break the delicate blade mean that he is hopeless as a fighter? I answered for her, since I already knew the metaphor. No, you hand him an axe or greatsword. This was exactly why I'd asked Dumbledore if this was a dueling school. Exactly. Minerva, Mr. Dresden, simply has a magical strength that far outstrips his magical finesse. Even training him to use a wand without destroying it would mean limiting him to the level of that finesse, while constantly having strength that wasn't able to be applied. It may be challenging to adapt some of our standard lessons, but I support his request to create his own foci. It might be interesting to see if we can better accommodate some of the other students in this manner as well. After all, Godric Gryffindor himself preferred to cast with sword and rod. Very well, McGonagall agreed, seeming to see the sense of it. I'll move the charms, defense, and transfiguration tests later and contact Professor Babbling about whether making your own foci would serve as a useful test of your knowledge of ancient runes. I think we have a large stock of cores and other materials in the runes lab, but Mr. Dresden will need to find compatible wood from the forest. So speaking of Hagrid, and that's how I found myself meeting the only person in the castle taller than me. It wasn't even a contest. If Professor McGonagall was standing on my shoulders, she could maybe look Hagrid in the eyes. While I'm sure the job of gamekeeper suited him, he'd probably want to stay outside in his oversized shack, even if he had another job. I wasn't sure he could even fit through all the corridors of the school I'd passed through. But he appeared to have an extremely friendly and pleasant nature. If you were that big and difficult to get along with, it wouldn't be long before people got out the pitchforks. "You're a wizard, Harry," he asked me as we set out into that afternoon into the apparently forbidden forest. He tied up his long, curly hair and beard as a nod to the warm summer day, and his giant black hound dog bounded along after us. It's just, I never met no wizard, didn't use a wand. Even I could use a wand, back when I were at Hogwarts. Had to get one twice as big as the other students, of course, or wouldn't have fit in my hand. I actually might be able to make do with something like that, I admitted. My blasting rod wasn't much bigger than that. Different way of setting up the core, though. Did you have to special order one that big? Oh, Ollivander didn't want to do it, neither. He hates to custom-make wands for folk. Likes to just make up a whole load of different ones and hope you'll find one that matches you. He stomped over a hillock into a part of the woods that was already getting darker due to the dense tree cover. I didn't add anything, and he ventured. It broke my heart when they snapped it. I could tell this was a difficult conversation and thought about just leaving it alone, but I bit and asked, why would they do that? Bad business back when I were in school. Got blamed for something I didn't do. It's real easy to expel the big chap. Can't have a wand if you don't finish school. Dumbledore's a great man, though. At least I have a job and a house. Well, as someone the ministry also just tried to railroad, that sounds even crazier than what I'm going through. Bet you didn't even get a trial. Course not. Another student's word against mine, and he were the old headmaster's favorite. To be fair, truth potion don't work too well on a guy my size. And it were all Dumbledore could do at the time pushing to keep me out of Azkaban. We crested another rise and dropped a part of the forest that looked more like an orchard, all the trees in regular rows without too much undergrowth. Anyway, here's one of the tree farms. All old-growth hardwood. Oh no, shame about that one. Hagrid had noticed an oak tree in the back that looked like it had split open from a lightning strike. It was a wonder it hadn't lit it, and the rest of the woods on fire. Maybe it was during a hard rainstorm. While I was looking at all the other trees, and even grabbed a couple of dry fallen branches that might make good blasting rods, the lightning-struck tree was calling to me somehow. When I touched the trunk, I knew that this was exactly the kind of resonance I'd been looking for. I wasn't expecting a swarm of fist-sized spiders to rush out of the middle of the storm-split tree trunk and right toward me. The stars speak I wasn't expecting to be attacked by a swarm of spiders, and I especially wasn't expecting the spider swarm to be chirping out things like hungry and food in tiny voices. Fortunately, I did not fall on my ass from surprise. My stride is long enough that even backpedaling, I was keeping ahead of the disturbing, chittering carpet coming toward me. "Oi, you lot, get away!" yelled Hagrid, slowly charging across the clearing. But they didn't seem to be listening, and I wasn't exactly sure what one big man, a dog, and a crossbow were going to be able to do to stop an infestation of this scale. Plus, I was a little freaked out, and may have been on the verge of developing a new phobia. It would have been a lot easier if I'd already made my foci, but beggars couldn't be choosers when there was a wall of talking arachnids bearing down on you. I gathered up my magic, flung my right hand while envisioning the effect I wanted, and yelled, "Bombarda," with a blasting rod. I can make the exploding charm drill through a couple feet of cinder blocks. Without a focus, the force spread out a lot, which actually worked better in this case. A ripple of force like the trailing edge of one of those slow-motion shots of a bomb going off shimmered through the air and flung the entire swarm of oversized spiders back across the clearing. I didn't notice any of them turn into spider goo, and I thought I even heard a few scream, "Wee," as they flew, so I guessed everything was all right. Hagrid had been yelling at them like they were sentient, so hopefully there wasn't an even bigger mommy spider somewhere that would be mad I'd defended myself from her kids. And bonus, the wave had knocked one of the bigger branches off the tree. I reached over to check it out, and it felt dry and solid. Exactly what I'd been looking for. "Sorry bout Thar," Hagrid panted, lumbering over. "I'll have to have another talk with Aragog about keeping his kids out o' this part o' the forest." He surveyed the area and then nodded. "Guess you weren't kidding about not needing a wand." "A focus definitely helps," I admitted, gesturing with the fallen branch. "Hopefully I'll be able to make some good ones out of these." "A fine choice. Storm-struck and won through battle," said a strangely resonant voice from behind us. Hagrid whirled around leveling his portable ballista, and I started to charge another attack. I wasn't expecting to see a romance novel cover wandering through the trees toward us. A decent Fabio knockoff from the waist up. It took me a moment to notice he was a horse from the waist down. Maybe the forest was actually forbidden to keep young witches from running off with the centaurs. "Oh, Firenze, you snuck up on us," Hagrid exhaled, lowering his giant crossbow. "We're Zeus, out here collecting wood for Harry here to make some big wands. Harry, this is Firenze. He's a seer." The horseman nodded in greetings, his long golden hair flowing about in a way that had to involve magic to not see him constantly getting it hung up on low-hanging brambles. Perhaps not wands, after that display of unfocused magic. The stars spoke to me of a young man that would come to the school wielding old magics. They also say darkness walks behind him. Will you stand against this chasing darkness, or merely try to stay ahead of it? After all, we once pinned our hopes on another young man named Harry. The centaur didn't seem like he actually wanted an answer, and I'd never been a huge fan of divination, so I just asked him a question right back. Do the stars speak of whether I'm going to get railroaded into wizard prison no matter what I do? He just shrugged. The darkness can represent many things. Even deep in the forest, we hear tales of the corruption within the wizard's government. Though the Dark Lord was banished nearly 10 cycles ago, the conditions that led to his rise are still present. Stars smile upon you, Harry. You'll need all the fortune you can get. With that pronouncement, he turned and cantered off into the woods. Thar's just centaurs for you, Harry, Hagrid chuckled. They're always showing up talking about the stars. My guess is they get just as worried about the future as the rest of us. You get what you needed. I hope so, I acknowledged. Hagrid was nice enough to take the large branch from me to carry, while I tied together the smaller sticks to take back. As we started heading toward the school, I asked, "So there's a Dark Lord, huh? And everyone's worried he'll come back." "Not everyone," the big man sighed. "Most folks use take for granted he's gone. Dumbledore's been trying to get them to make changes for a decade in case he comes back. Some of the stuff thar's been happening this summer, it makes me nervous. Even if he's really gone, well, like the man said, wouldn't be hard for another dark wizard to move in and start rig back up." He shook his head, as if to physically banish the dark thoughts. "Darn, tell the little ones though, or rig. We try to keep Hogwarts a hopeful place for the youngs. You ever think that maybe you should tell the kids what's going on earlier, since they're the ones who go on to the ministry, and keep it I asked. We walked for a few minutes in silence as Hagrid thought for him to finally admit, "Mebso, it's juice hard to look at those innocent lil faces and think, this one's not even 20 years from Bane, a corrupt politician." He sighed and thought for another second and added, "Probably should, though. Got a Malfoy common in this year. Ran into that boy the other day in the alley. Already a real PCO work." It was hard to look at such a cheerful, giant man so down, so as we walked back up to his cabin, I tried to soften what I'd been saying. "It's probably not guaranteed, or anything. I've changed a lot since I was 11. Maybe you can keep assuming they're good kids. Just try to give them more perspective earlier." I tried to add in a joke. "I mean, they're not a lost cause until they're nearly 16 after all." I don't think he got it. Maybe I didn't get it either. Chapter 3, Stone Face 3, Field Trips. Chapter text proper placement. The Runes lab was, in fact, as well stocked as McGonagall had insisted. My first placement test was Professor babbling overseeing my plan for making a new blasting rod, staff, and shield bracelet. She seemed impressed, and said she didn't think there would be much to catch up on before I was at the same level as the rest of her class. Unfortunately, Justin had not put much focus on astronomy at all, short of the basics of using a calendar to plan for ritually significant dates. Meanwhile, Hogwarts, for some reason, thought it was a more important class than runes, and taught it starting with first years. The professor seemed to think that I'd be in her class with the first years, if I didn't make some major headway memorizing the heavens. Since they were electives, and I was definitely already interested in arithmancy and runes to fill those slots, I didn't bother with placement for divination or care of magical creatures. McGonagall suggested that I take the Muggle Studies test just as an experiment. Turns out, I was already ready to pass my newts on the subject. Personally, I figured I knew more about the subject than the professor. After the test, McGonagall acknowledged my assertion that this was a big problem. The distracted and terse potions professor decided that my technique was adequate for my age, though I hadn't made some of the potions that were part of the curriculum, and I'd need to know them for the owls. Similarly, the related herbology class had a similar result, competent but missing certain plants that were important to the British tests. To my credit, most of them didn't grow in America, and I could probably recognize a bunch of plants these kids had never seen. My Pigeon Latin that I'd always been ashamed of was apparently far ahead of grade level here, and the magic theory Justin had drilled me on was comprehensive. Professor Vector seemed excited to have me in her arithmancy class, especially since my C+ in high school geometry and algebra was way ahead of the mathematical background most of these kids had. Justin had seen zero sense in training me to ride a broom, and there were so many ways to teleport, even if I didn't want to just drive a car. So the bird-aspected flying professor declared me completely hopeless for her class. Fortunately, it wasn't actually on the owls, just their P equivalent. McGonagall seemed strangely disappointed and muttered something about still being down a seeker. Similarly, we had wasted no time whatsoever on British wizarding history. The ghost that taught the class had provided me a parchment that was mostly asking the dates of various goblin rebellions. I figured I might just see how much of that I could self-study, if not skip entirely. Finally, after a couple of weeks, I had the requisite tools to take the tests for what Hogwarts thought of as wand magic classes. I actually didn't wind up using them much in McGonagall's transfiguration test, since her tasks were more on the vein of taking as long as I needed to turn a hedgehog into a pincushion than the combat transfigurations that Justin was so fond of. With all the time in the world, she was surprised to watch me ignore the foci. She'd so generously given me time to make only to scribe a chalk circle around the animal or object, and treat the transfiguration as a short ritual rather than a charm. The circle, Mr. Dresden. Like the headmaster explained, I have way more power than finesse. When I have time to treat it as a ritual, I can charge up the circle and then slowly shape what I want it to do. Justin called this thaumaturgy. Do you not teach that here? With that little zinger, I released the circle, and the hedgehog immediately popped directly into a pincushion, as she'd specified. 5 points to Gryffindor, she exclaimed, even despite what she'd taken to referring to as cheek. I'm not sure if those points will stand, as we have not technically begun the year. But good show. I'm quite looking forward to how the rest of the class will respond to your alternate form of these techniques. Now, have you learned the vanishing charm yet? After hitting a few more points of the transfiguration curriculum in unexpected ways, my next test was charms. The professor was so tiny and obviously so smart that I almost missed some instructions because I was busy imaging a buddy comedy starring him and Hagrid. I was pretty sure I'd seen a motorcycle with a sidecar in Hagrid's barn, and it would just be perfect. If anything, Flitwick was more confused by the variability in my capabilities than most of the other professors. With my staff and blasting rod ready to go, I effortlessly demonstrated exploding, banishing, fire-making, freezing, and all the other charms that involved directing energy or motion at a target and were considered age-appropriate magic. But I was a complete blank on things like the cheering charm and tickling charm that were taught to first years. Mr. Dresden, have you studied anything besides combat magic? Asked the half-goblin. I gave an apologetic smile and said, in hindsight, it was pretty obvious that my mentor wasn't really a good person, sir. Well, we'll just have to show you that there's more to magic than dueling. This year should find you well ahead on the more offensive magics we teach, but I hope you can master some of the more subtle charms. In particular, I doubt any of your foci are appropriate to most of that part of the curriculum. My challenge to you, Mr. Dresden, is to come up with a focus that will accommodate those effects. I can provide you some examples of how the Goblin Nation accomplishes such things, as they are not allowed to use wands. You see, it's not your lack of a wand that surprises me, it's your utterly martial focus in your education. And then it was on to defense against the dark arts. It seemed like a weird hodgepodge of a subject, as if magical combat wasn't enough to fill a class period, so they stole pieces from charms and magical creatures class as well. McGonagall had even let slip that they'd had trouble keeping a long-term professor for the last several years, with some professors being more competent than others, and some wildly deviating from the lesson plan, which meant I had no idea what to expect would be required for fifth-year competence. I wasn't expecting my teacher to be lurking just inside the door of the classroom as I walked in, standing by a large item of furniture awkwardly placed amid the normal tables and chairs. Ah, D.D. Dresden, stuttered the skinny man in the elaborate turban. Are you already T2B? Begin your exam. I shrugged, and he stepped away from what I could now see was a freestanding wardrobe behind him, opening the door as he went. Emerging from the shadows within was a young woman's form. As the light hit her, I noticed that she was very badly burned, bones showing through her skin and blackened clothing indistinguishable from charred flesh. As the shambling dead girl's milky eyes blindly cast about to look at me, she spoke in the unmistakable voice of my girlfriend, Elaine. "Harry, how could you do this to me?" Up your alley I hadn't fallen on my ass when I was swarmed by spiders, but I did when confronted by the walking corpse of my girlfriend. It's hard to look like a hardened battle wizard when you're all legs and elbows, trying to scrabble backwards across the stone floor to escape. My first love's charred husk shambled slowly after me, asking, "I was under the imperious, Harry. I needed you to save me. Instead, you made me into this. Harry, just hold me. Why won't you come to me, love? Why would this asshole of a professor spring something like this on me? Had someone found her near the house? Was FiendFyre dark enough to reanimate her, or was it something that Justin's ritual did? Perhaps that wraith possessed her instead. Could someone be evil enough to find her body and reanimate it just to screw with me like this? There were so many easier ways to punish me. The man in the turban just looked on calmly from behind, with perhaps an interested, but in no way triumphant expression on his face. Was this just part of the exam? Were the reanimated dead on the fourth-year syllabus? Wait. The exam. What might a younger student need to fight against that fit the equation? As Justin always drilled into me through quite painful lessons, ignore your pain, work past your fear, and solve the problem. FiendFyre still gave auras difficulties, and undead with minds were even rarer and harder to fight. And why was it so specific to me? Why keep it in a closet? It finally came to me as I hit the wall and couldn't scramble any further, and it took me another precious few moments to remember the counter and visualize what I wanted to happen. Her blackened hands were inches from my face when I shouted, "Ridiculous," and channeled my magic. She suddenly transformed into the least threatening, shambling dead person I could think of, the fruity yummy mummy from the cereal boxes. I gave a half-hearted laugh, and the boggart was sucked like it was on a bungee cord back into the cabinet, which the professor slammed shut behind it. He leaned, relaxed, against the cabinet, and gave me a somewhat sarcastic clap. "Well, D.D. Dresden, that was tea, truly a FiendFyre tea to be behold. I suspect the new third years will not have anywhere near such an elaborate horror." He tilted his head in thought, then admitted, "With that D-degree of M-monster, and without any warning, I'll have Tita CC call that an excellent effort." Still trying to collect myself, and feeling the massive bruise spreading across my ass, I snarked, "Is that the whole exam, or do you need me to come back when you've got something else terrifying to surprise me with? Full moon's in, what, a week? I can come back then for the werewolf." He gave me an extremely calculating look, then smirked. "And no, I think that will be sufficient for the PP practical. I've written on the B-board several of the other CC creatures, C-covered through fourth year. An oral examination of how Tita CC counter them should suffice." The exam was pretty easy after that. I honestly wasn't sure why this class needed to be anything more than an irregular seminar if all it taught was how to fight or evade a handful of dangerous creatures. Maybe because it took Quirrell 3 times as long to explain everything with that stutter. Before I left, he intimated that he was considering working my style of magic into his fifth-year classes this year, which might at least make the class less of a waste of my time. Ultimately, other than being way behind on astronomy and British wizarding history, and needing to catch up on a few arbitrary points of the other subjects, McGonagall was happy to pass me on to take classes with people my own age. Especially since I didn't give a damn about passing the British tests, except so far as they wouldn't have an excuse to throw me out of school and back into Azkaban, I figured I'd get by. Considering I expected to have another week of trying to catch up and working on foci, it was a surprise to me when McGonagall called me to her office on the last Sunday of August, dressed for the outdoors. "Are you interested in leaving the castle, Mr. Dresden?" I smirked. I knew it. Quirrell is going to make me fight a werewolf, and just wanted me to let my guard down. While I applaud keeping track of the full moon, as paying attention to the sky will only help repair your woefully inadequate knowledge of astronomy, I don't intend to be out nearly as late as moonrise. She gave me a moment to internalize just how thoroughly I'd been outsnocked. Oh yeah, we were starting to understand one another. "A few of your fifth-year materials and texts are not in adequate supply in the castle. I was informed that several of your housemates will be picking up their own school supplies today, so it seemed reasonable to me that taking you along would be beneficial rather than just sending away for them. Pick up school supplies. Make some new friends to beat the rush. Got it. Clearly, I hadn't been sufficiently enthusiastic. We can, of course, skip the trip if you aren't up to it. I tried to put on a smile and think about the positives. No, no, I appreciate the opportunity to get out of here for a little while. McGonagall fixed me with a suspicious stare. I expect that you will not attempt to flee or otherwise do something to cause trouble. From what Albus has informed me, at least one senior Auror is likely to take advantage of such a slip. I'd been learning from her poker face, and thought I held onto how close she'd come to my plans. After a moment more of waiting for me to slip, she nodded and lit her fire. I'm always disappointed when the school year starts and our personal flu connections are limited outside the castle for security reasons. You've used this method of travel before. We're headed to Diagon Alley. She waited for me to take a pinch of flu powder and precede her. I idly wondered if this method of travel was working off the same theory that allowed Dumbledore's Phoenix to transport him. It was the only thing that made this have any sense whatsoever. After an endless moment whirling through the flaming void that was Britain's flu network, I managed to keep my balance after being spit out in a dingy pub. Apparently, I didn't rate a second glance before the clientele went back to their breakfasts. McGonagall was only a few seconds behind me, and she at least rated a morning Minerva from several of the patrons. It took me a moment to realize that this was the interface between London and Diagon Alley. When Justin had brought us here a couple of times, we'd just taken a bus in and come through the front door. I followed the professor through the back and watched her tap a code onto the bricks of the back alley. As the wall faded away, I asked, "If muggles can't see the pub anyway, why do you need to know the secret to get through here?" "The anti-muggle charms on the leaky cauldron aren't foolproof, and some of our enemies are magical but can't open the wall," she explained. "Let me know when you've caught up sufficiently on your history texts to tell me about all the times this wall was the final barrier against calamity." "Fair enough," I allowed, wincing internally at getting new homework. I actually had two suspicions. One was that someone had just worked really hard on the persistent enchantment to get the wall to slide out of the way a brick at a time. The other was that McGonagall could now use remedial homework as a way to get out of answering difficult questions. "Here's the list of purchases you need to make, and the galleons to cover it," she said, handing me a strip of parchment and a small coin purse from a pocket inside her jacket. "The Weasleys are skilled bargain hunters, so if you let them guide you, there may be enough left over for discretionary items." We hadn't gotten deep into the Renaissance festival-style strip mall that was Diagon Alley before McGonagall spotted the crowd we were apparently here to meet. They would be difficult to miss, since it was so rare to see so many redheads in one place. A boy about my age that seemed to be the eldest of the group apart from the obvious parents noticed us first and got his mother's attention as they moved from one shop to the next. While the rest waited for us to make our way over to them, the young man rushed over to us. Up close, it was obvious that he was wound extremely tightly as he gushed, "Professor, I just cannot thank you enough for the privilege. I swear that I shall not let you down." I didn't yet really have an ear for the different English dialects, but it struck me that he was fighting very hard to speak in the proper, received pronunciation, rather than his native accent. It was an interesting contrast with the professor's unrepentant Scottish brogue. "I don't doubt it, Mr. Weasley. Mr. Dresden, this is one of your roommates, and the new boys' prefect for Gryffindor, Percival Weasley. This is Harry Dresden, who is transferring to Hogwarts from a private apprenticeship. I hope you'll be able to fit some time in amongst your duties and studies to look out for him." I got the impression that Percival was about to start stammering excuses about his very limited time, and was just trying to figure out how to do so politely to his head of house. McGonagall saw it too, and sweetened the offer. Mr. Dresden was taught a very unusual style of spellwork that emphasizes wandless magic and making his own focus items. While he needs some help catching up in certain subjects, I believe he could be a great help to you in arithmancy, runes, and defense. That caught his attention, and actually had him considering me rather than dismissing me out of hand. After a moment, he extended a hand. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Dresden. I look forward to this arrangement." He had a nervous, somewhat limp handshake, but I got a sense of a strong, controlled magical core. Likewise, you go by Percival or Percy. Taking too long, said one of the other boys, who appeared to be a couple years younger, as he walked up next to us. Yeah, we all want to meet him, insisted another one that appeared to be a mirror image, flanking Percy from the other side. I could feel Percy tense up as they approached, before withdrawing his hand from the handshake. I thought he also had a small nervous tick in one eye from the twins interrupting. Percy is indeed fine. I suppose going by Weasley will be just as hard this year. You're assuming a lot about whether Ron's going to make it into the house, one twin asserted. Charlie graduated last year, the other explained to me, so we'll be back up to 4 if Ron gets in. 5 next year with Ginny, added the first. Assuming they could keep up this patter forever, I answered Percy, who was mentally retreating into his shell in the face of the barrage. Then please call me Harry, to make things even. I don't really get the last name thing. I called my old mentor by his first name. What a sense of fair play, the second twin applauded. I feel like we're bosom friends already, continued the first. In that spirit, I'm Fred. And I'm George, explained the second. They looked at each other and shrugged. Unless we got that backwards again. I could suddenly see why Percy was so high-strung. Having these two for little brothers was probably exhausting. McGonagall already looked tired, and she presumably had a whole summer free from them. She looked like she was sending some kind of non-verbal signal to their mother to rescue her. Fred, George, what did I say? The short but seemingly formidable woman shouted at them from across the alley. Best behavior, no antics. Yes, Mum, they chorused, suddenly all angelic smiles, and headed back to the rest of their family. Percy led me over slightly behind, and McGonagall still further back, likely wondering if she'd made a huge mistake. As we approached, their mother took it upon herself to introduce the rest of the clan before the twins could do so. She was a hugger, it turned out, which was unexpected. I had a brief moment of not knowing what to do with my arms, and then I was free. I'm Molly Weasley. This is my husband Arthur. You've met Percival, Fred, and George, and my youngest are Ronald and Ginevra. Ron and Ginny, the twins insisted, Sato voice. She continued, ignoring the distraction. Minerva mentioned you were a new transfer to Gryffindor. He's so tall, and came in on Percy's year. Just imagine the size of the troll they made him wrestle, one of the twins whispered to Ron. The tiny boy's eyes widened so much they nearly popped out of his head. I tried not to snort at the boy winding up his brother, and answered Mrs. Weasley with the sanitized version of the story I'd worked out. I had a private apprenticeship, and my mentor brought me to Britain a few months ago. He died suddenly and left me in a tight spot. Headmaster Dumbledore was kind enough to make sure I didn't get lost in the system, I guess. While that seemed to satisfy Mrs. Weasley, there was a snort of derision from a nearby doorway, as Aura Dawlish leaned around revealing that he'd been eavesdropping. Died suddenly is certainly a pleasant way of describing it. Why don't you tell your new friends what really happened? Dresden. Cat Lady's the man who decided to make himself my archenemy, slouched off the wall, and stood to face me down from across the field of redheads. He was still wearing his dirty trench coat and muggle suit, which made him stand out even more amid all the robes. Maybe your new friends would like to ask you about how your house burned down with your mentor still inside. They might even wonder, like I do, what happened to the other teenager I found out was registered as living in that house. Did you kill Elaine Mallory, too, Dresden? That seemed to steal my breath away, like a physical punch to the gut. I barely noticed my hand drifting into my robes for my blasting rod, but in hindsight, Dawlish did. He was smirking and cradling a wand up his sleeve, clearly just waiting for me to take a shot. Fortunately, McGonagall was right behind me and not inclined to let this play out. John Dawlish, if I could still take points from you, I would. Imagine such provocation against a student on a school shopping trip. Despite his carefully cultivated exterior as a maverick cop, I thought I saw him wilt a bit under her attention. Just saw his trace move to the alley, Professor. He could have been pulling a runner. It's all completely legal. If you have nothing better to do than rush out to chaperone a student's shopping trip, then there's little I can say about that, McGonagall allowed. But you can do that without confronting him with unsubstantiated allegations in front of a crowd. If you have more questions about your case, Hogwarts is happy to arrange additional interviews with his magical guardian present. Maybe he hadn't actually seen the assistant headmistress behind me when he jumped in, because Dawlish seemed to take a moment trying to come up with a comeback and find nothing. Lamely, he admitted, "Fair enough." Trying to saunter away without turning his back to us, he tossed off, "See you around, Dresden." Entertainment over, the bystanders that had been gathering continued on their way. The Weasleys had the presence of mind to wait until Dawlish was out of earshot, but probably still lurking nearby, before starting up. "Did you really kill your mentor?" asked the youngest boy, Ron. "Headmaster Dumbledore has done his own research and declared Mr. Dresden not guilty," explained McGonagall, further increasing my appreciation of the woman. Arthur Weasley added his 2 cents for the first time. "Auror Dawlish has a reputation around the ministry. Among other sterling personal qualities, he doesn't like to let go of his first suspect, despite what the evidence says." Between those two assertions, that seemed to mollify everyone, though I could tell the kids would be looking for opportunities to dig for more information later. Marley Weasley started leading us further into the alley, and her husband fell back to ask me an unrelated question. "We recently got an interesting load of Muggle artifacts in the misuse office, and they have us stumped. Minerva mentioned you were raised Muggle, and I was wondering if you had any inkling about the intended function of a rubber duck." After assuring Mr. Weasley that, indeed, rubber duckies with time-delayed charms would be an innocuous method of delivering mischief in the Muggle world, we were able to engage in shopping. While it was constant chaos, moving 5 young Weasleys from store to store, Mrs. Weasley somehow kept them more or less in orbit and on task. The professor had been right. They definitely had an eye for bargains, as one must with a family that size. Given how the parents doted on young Ginny, I realized my initial assumption of wizard Catholics was probably incorrect, and they just wanted a daughter badly enough to keep trying. With their help, I'd filled out the supply list and still had a few coins left over, while my practical side suggested that I should look into how to convert it into Muggle cash. Since I presently couldn't even take a bus out of London if I needed to, everyone would be extremely suspicious if I suggested a trip to the bank to change out my money. Instead, I laid out for a few uncommon components that didn't seem to be in the student-accessible cupboards at the school. "Wide-Eye Potion is 3rd year," Percy stated, after working out what I was doing from the ingredients. "Are you planning to revise for the owls with that, or?" I shrugged. "Not exactly, but it seemed like a useful potion to keep on hand. I'm thinking about making some girding potion, too. Do you think these Darksea eggs will keep?" While Percy was suddenly having a revelation about making potions as performance enhancers instead of just to turn in for a grade, I felt a bump and a piece of paper being pushed into my hand. The ingredients shop was packed, but a moment later I caught a glance at a woman leaving the store. Her hair color and outfit was unfamiliar, but the amused, mad-eyed glance out of fine-boned features made it obvious who I was dealing with. She blew me a kiss as she sauntered out of the store, and was under a disillusioned veil before I could see which way she went. My overly finicky roommate was still trying to figure out whether the Darksea eggs were a good buy, so I glanced at the card that had been slipped into my hand. "Saw you running. The trace is a problem. Be sure to take the train. I'll have a solution for you." Great, my godmother was meddling again. As if I didn't have a big enough problem with Dawlish following me, she was too. At least I knew what the Aura's intentions were. Worrying about that madwoman's plans wasn't going to let me sleep easy. In fact, the whole collection of issues finally hit me that night, after I'd managed to extricate myself from the Weasleys and get back to Hogwarts. Dawlish bringing Elaine back up broke down whatever repressing I'd been doing on Quirrell's Boggart, and that, in particular, resulted in some truly outstanding nightmares. I'd given up sleep as unlikely and slipped down to the runes lab to make some more progress on focus items. I'd gotten a nice pile of leather trimmings that I thought I might be able to do something with. I'd been working in the firelight for a couple of hours before I noticed the cat perched on the hearth. She was a skinny thing, dust-colored with golden eyes. I gave her a closed-lipped smile and nodded at the fire. I agree that it's ridiculous that they already have to run the fireplaces and it's still August. Scotland, am I right? With an interested tilt of her head, the cat began stalking toward me, with a weird hesitance. At first I thought she was skittish, but it was more like she thought I was going to run than that she was planning to. It took the better part of a minute for her to cross the 10 feet from the fire and leap up on my work table. I grabbed a discarded strip of leather and started twitching it across the table like a mouse tail. Another strange look at me like she wasn't entirely sure how to play, and then she pounced on the strip and started playing with abandon. I'd given up on getting any more work done and was just sitting on my stool petting the cat when an old, hunched man shuffled into the room. I'd seen him around over the past few weeks, but hadn't figured out what he did. Ah, not even classes yet, and already a late-night wanderer. You're supposed to be in bed, boy. I hadn't actually even thought about a curfew, used to setting my own schedule as long as I didn't bother anyone else. But I guess it made sense, with a bunch of kids running around without parents in a big magical castle, that you wouldn't want to try to figure out which ones were responsible enough to wander. And I didn't want to disturb my new feline friend enough to rail against unjust authority. So I just nodded and said, "Sorry, sir, had some nightmares and they didn't tell me about a curfew." For a moment, I saw a sneer forming and worried he was going to make an issue of it no matter how polite I'd been, but then he finally noticed me petting the cat, and that shocked him. Never seen Mrs. Norris take to anyone else like that. "I like cats," I acknowledged, "and she's a sweetheart." The cat gave a faint meow that sounded almost exactly like, "Yeah." That had both me and the old man snorting in laughter. "What's that you're working on, anyway?" he asked, looking over at my stitched-together leather pieces. I stretched it out so he could see that it was almost vest-shaped. "Hopefully a protective jerkin if the charms will take." "Aye, that's a good idea. Seen plenty of kids hexed in the back around here." He thought about it for a second, clearly interested. "You an enchanter?" I gave him the wavy hand so-so gesture, admitting, "I'm pretty solid on making foci to channel my own magic like a wand." This seemed like a good test of the theory of whether I can make something that will work when I'm not channeling energy into it. He twitched a finger, surreptitiously feeling the leather, obviously way into the idea. Though I wasn't totally keen on befriending this strange old man, he had a nice cat, so he couldn't be all bad. "If it works out, I could try to make something similar for you." That got a genuine, toothy smile, and he demurred. "Only if it's no trouble. You're the first one in years I've seen do something practical. All the other young wizards that can enchant things, nothing but shenanigans." Thinking of these bad kids brought him back to the present, so he insisted, "You better get back to your common room. And no night wandering once school's in session." "Got it," I smiled, giving Mrs. Norris a last scritch behind the ears before collecting my stuff. "Good night, so good night, Mrs." Chapter 4, Stone-Faced 4, Train Gangs. Chapter text trainspotting I was in Professor McGonagall's office, dressed for travel, and confused. So I flew to the station. Takes me moments. Then I ride a train for hours to get back here. She shook her head, clearly distracted by everything else she had to do on her Sunday morning before students arrived, and trying to get me out of her hair. "You're welcome to wait here, Mr. Dresden. The Hogwarts Express is a bonding experience for the students. You'll have a chance to meet everyone when they're all getting together, instead of them running into you here already in cliques." "No, that makes sense if everyone's doing it," I admitted, especially since I needed to meet my godmother on the train anyway. "It's just flues, apparitions, portkeys, brooms. Isn't there even supposed to be some space-bending magical bus? Why, a train that moves at the speed of a train." "Volume, Mr. Dresden." Over 250 students, and all their luggage would be a substantial magical outlay to move, but trains are time-tested and efficient. I moved to stand in front of her fireplace, still arguing, admittedly at this point, just trying to get a rise out of my head of house. But it's not like most of them live in London. They're already using magical transport to get to King's Cross. "Have a nice trip, Mr. Dresden. This flue will be closed soon for the school year, so this cannot be your way back. Stay out of trouble." "King's Cross," she said, flinging in flue powder with one hand and shoving me into the fire with the other. I staggered out onto a concrete platform where a mostly cosmetic fireplace had been built into a stone wall behind me, likely in a way it could be hidden when the train wasn't traveling to this hidden platform. The big red train in question was so efficient, it clearly hadn't been updated in at least a century, coal smoke already filling the bay. If it wasn't for magic, everyone here would probably die of carbon monoxide poisoning. It was interesting to see more witches and wizards than I'd ever seen before in one place. A couple hundred students and their families made for a substantial crowd. Most were trying to pass as muggles, with varying levels of success, but those coming in through the flu like I had were an extremely eclectic bunch, and apparently familiars were allowed to just wander. Full early, I went and found a bench to sit on, and people watch with the hope that I was going to get to pet so many cats. I was also considering whether I ought to make a break for it. I'd had to leave my staff back at the castle, but I could manage a lot with just the foci I had hidden on me. This was the first time without some kind of adult watching my every move for a month, and possibly my last chance to escape until Christmas. I'd read up on the trace, and as long as I didn't actually use any magic, they couldn't pinpoint me. Dawlish probably knew I'd used the flu, but I could disappear in the chaos out into Muggle King's Cross, hop on another train, and take my chances that they just did spot checks on tickets. But even in a best-case scenario, I wasn't sure how I'd collect the belongings I'd stashed without magic, much less get out of the country. I needed to know how to get out from under the trace, and for that, I'd need to speak to my godmother. You're considering running. I didn't know how she worked out her timing, but as usual it was uncanny. Think of the devil, and she appears. She'd plaited her dark hair up and hidden it under a blue witch's hat, except for a waterfall of bangs hanging across her face, and had on matching robes. If she'd been human, she'd have looked like an extremely attractive woman in her 30s. If she had the lifespan of a witch, she could be twice that. She could be using glamour charms and be any age, or she could be immortal, as she'd implied on more than one occasion. She could just be a lying madwoman with an unhealthy fascination with me and the dark arts. I don't think I'd get far, I admitted, trying not to look directly at her and do this spy style. Just two unrelated people taking a load off on the bench. That aura is a problem, she smirked. I could get rid of him. I assume you'll tell me no just like all my previous offers, but after Justin, maybe you've changed your mind. I haven't. That was an accident. I think you may have left out some of the drawbacks of that curse. It burns such pretty colors, she tittered. It burns and burns. If you did it right, you get a mascot. I bet yours was a kitty. I didn't get a good look at it. I was too busy fending off whatever it was Justin summoned. I was digging. She rarely gave up any information that was actually useful. Harry, I did warn you to get out. I never wanted you to have to see that. You could have come with me. You still can. I take my duties to your mother seriously. When Justin was merely abusive, I wasn't willing to take that offer, and him proving to be homicidal didn't make it that much better. This was one of our more linear conversations. Usually they were much more like trying to solve a puzzle out of insane, malevolent ramblings. The first puzzle I'd solved is that she considered mind control and torture to be perfectly loving ways of raising a child. I think I'll let this play out for a while longer, but as always, I do appreciate that the offer remains open. I'd also worked out that it paid to be polite to the madwoman that believed my mother had made me her responsibility. Very well. You can reach me by the usual methods if you change your mind or need more direct assistance. In the meantime, this is what I mentioned, she hissed, passing a rolled-up parchment to me. It goes without saying. You should not be caught with a ritual that allows you to slew off the trace. Certain parties would be very upset. Understood. Thank you, godmother. I did manage to save several of the texts you wanted, and will get them to you as soon as I have the opportunity to retrieve my cash. I was hoping reminding her of our last deal would keep her from thinking about how much further this ritual put me in her debt. In many of our conversations, she'd been absolutely fixated on equitable deals. I knew you would, Harry. You're your mother's son. You don't let surprises distract you from your objectives. The train horn sounded, noting that it was half an hour until it would leave. Of course, with that distraction, my godmother was gone. Ah, I see Crab and Goyle, I heard a blonde woman a few paces away say to her small son. Go collect them and get a good compartment. Woman, her son, and a man with long, silver hair stood about nearby as if they owned the entire platform. From the material and embroidery on their robes, they might have. With such a posh trio nearby, no one had paid a moment's attention to my conversation. As the boy dragged his trunk off down the platform to meet his friends, The man turned and glanced my way, seemingly noting the empty seat next to me before politely looking away and whispering to his wife. Well, maybe someone had paid attention. I hoped they hadn't overheard anything that would be a problem for me. Railroaded shortly before the train was about to leave, I spotted the Weasleys, their red hair distinctive even among a couple hundred other witches and wizards. The twins and the youngest boy headed toward the rear of the train, while Percy split off to head toward the front, since he was the only one I actually knew my own age. I headed that way as well. With my longer strides, I caught up to him as he was about to climb up into one of the first train cars. "Percy," I greeted, catching his attention. "Wah, Dresden. I mean, Harry, hello." He looked awkward for a minute, glancing behind him at the car, realizing I might be his responsibility. As an extreme introvert, he probably wasn't looking forward to being my social connection. Somewhat lamely, he explained, "I actually have to meet with the other prefects." He absently polished the shiny badge pinned to his robes while thinking, "You should meet with Wood. He's one of our other roommates. If you find the twins, they'll be able to find him. I'll be by on rounds later." I let the kid off easy. "Fair enough, thanks, Percy. Enjoy your prefect meeting." He nodded, grateful to have been released, and leaped up the stairs into the compartment. Since it looked like the train was about to get moving, I climbed up into the next car and started heading down the aisles, expecting the Weasleys to only be slightly harder to find on the train than they were off. The trains I'd been on previously, in my admittedly limited experience, had been set up more like airplanes or buses, with open-air carriages of rows of seats and an aisle in the middle. Some of them might have been especially fancy, with the seats alternating back and forward so groups could face each other, maybe with a table in between. I hadn't actually been on one with this style, where the aisles ran down one window and most of each car was enclosed compartments for around 6 people, maybe more, if they were very friendly. I wondered if they actually had enough cars for all the cliques. Based on the kids that already had robes on with their house colors displayed, everyone seemed to be grouping pretty heavily based on house. There didn't seem to be a lot of mixing between ages, either. With apparently an average of 10 kids per house per year, that would be too many for one compartment, even if everyone was comfortable squeezing in. In fact, the cars were probably exactly the right size to make it obvious who was extraneous to the in-groups. Could school administrators even do math? Importantly, for someone like me who had precisely 0 friends, but liked to affect an aloof and unconcerned air, was there space to sit if I gave up on trying to insert myself into this fraught hierarchy? There were a lot of reasons that Elaine and I hadn't mixed with the other kids, even when we attended public schools. But this kind of thing was dramatically easier to deal with when you had at least one friend who also didn't have a clue. By the time I had twisted myself up into a ball of anxiety about how this was a bad idea, I spotted the twin redheads in a compartment surrounding a black boy their age, peeking into a cardboard box he had on his lap. A girl their age sat across the compartment, trying not to look interested. One of the twins happened to see me stop and look curiously, suddenly changing his point of interest. "Oi, it's Dresden. He might have killed a guy," confided the second twin to the other 2. "Has auras confronting him in the alley and everything. It's very noir," the first embroidered the tale. "He's in 5th year, so even if it's not true that room will hopefully have more to talk about than studies and Quidditch this year," the second explained, finishing the thought. Annoyed that they were so casually spreading rumors that I was a murderer, especially due to how close to home they hit, I decided to step in, all exaggerations. "I'm actually quite boring." I'm sure Percy's shiny prefect badge will remain the talk of the room for months. "And he's American?" asked the girl, clearly barely sidetracked. "He might be Canadian, Patricia," insisted the boy with the dreadlocks. "Say about and poutine." Wonderful. The twins had another friend that was just like them. No wonder Percy had hidden himself up in the front with the other responsible kids. When I just smirked, not about to out my nationality for his amusement, he asked, "Want to see my spider? It's enormous." "Does it talk?" I asked, deadpan. Everyone looked at me trying to decide if I was stupid or crazy. The ones that tried to eat me in the Forbidden Forest a couple weeks ago talked. That stunned them all into moments of blissful silence as they considered all the implications. Point, Harry Dresden. Hopefully that would be the rumor instead of me killing my mentor. The beautiful moment was ended when Patricia asked in an odd tone, "Are you a cowboy? You should have a hat." "Don't really like hats," I replied instantly out of reflex. Before they could continue grilling me, I asked, "Percy said I should find one of our other roommates would, and that you two might know where he is." "We haven't seen him yet," one of the twins considered. "But he might be with the girls," the other suggested. "Katie Bell is going to be on the Quidditch team this year, so Angelina and Alicia went up the train to find her. You probably passed right by them." The boy with the spider realized that I had no idea who any of those people were and explained, "Look for the two black, athletic girls talking about sports with a brown-haired white girl." I nodded at him in thanks and headed away, hearing the twins thank their friend. "Good save, Lee. We never want to be like, the black girls, but it's okay if you explain it. Why are you looking at us like that?" I remembered passing a group of that description in the previous car. They did, in fact, stand out among the otherwise pasty collection of British witches and wizards. When I got back to the compartment they'd been sitting in, the door was closed, and the windows were blocked by three boys who probably thought they were being quiet enough to not be heard in the aisle. "Fresh meat this year, huh, Belle?" growled the middle boy. "Would have you trying to fill Charlie Weasley's broom? Are you going to join these two and get outplayed by me?" "Yeah, right, Flint," one of the girls responded. "All your chaser line is good for is trying to drag things out long enough for Higgs to find the snitch. When's the last time Slytherin beat us on goals?" "It's going to be this year," Flint countered. Copper was a mudblood pants, but he could take a hit. "Nothing but you three little girls now. It's going to be like getting run over by this train." "You're certainly as slow as this train," one of the girls snarked. "Just watch your back for bludgers, you snotty bitch," one of the other boys asserted. "Be a shame for one of those pretty faces to get knocked into the pitch at 80 miles per hour. You know what degloving means?" I did, and my adrenaline started to flow as I thought back to the boggart of Elaine. Big talk from someone that can't even hold his bat properly. "Maybe we'll just show you right now," said Flint, leaning what appeared to be a not inconsiderable bulk away from the window and presumably into the girls' faces. I'd been content to let the girls dominate in the battle of insults, but I couldn't take the chance that this was going to go as far as Flint was implying it was about to. I flung open the cart door and yelled, "Hey, assholes!" Quidditch all three jumped and spun around, clearly not even aware that I'd been lurking behind them for a minute. "Who the hell are you?" demanded Flint. From the front, he looked like someone shaved a caveman and dressed him in modern clothes. All three of their hands were straying to pockets, and I shook my shield bracelet free of my sleeve just in case. Flint was burly, but he was shorter than me, and I was able to get a good look at the girls who'd been backed against the side of the train behind him. I grinned at what I saw and met his eyes. "I'm the guy that yells, 'Hey, assholes,' to give the girls you were messing with a chance to get wands out and pointed at your backs." They glanced over their shoulders and saw I was telling the truth and started to grab for their own wands before I interrupted with, "Ah, how sure are you those little girls don't know any good curses they're really motivated to use right now? Imagine the fun we could have the rest of the afternoon after some body binds," one of the girls suggested. The bullies were obviously trying to think of a comeback, so I stepped out of line of the doorway and said, "This is the part where you run off before you make it any worse." After another moment, trying to work up the courage to do or say something that didn't get them hexed, they growled and left. Once the last one had cleared the doorway and line of fire from the girls, Flint snarled back over his shoulder, "Watch your back, new kid." I snarked after him. The last guy that said that to me hadn't just been run off by 13-year-olds, so it had more authority. You need to work on your timing. While that probably just made it more likely they'd come after me at some point, I'd never been good at keeping my mouth shut. Fortunately, they kept going into the next train car. "Sorry about that, ladies," I said to the three Quidditch players. "I don't like to butt in uninvited on someone else's showdown, but..." They looked like they were coming down from their own adrenaline surge after the confrontation, and one of the older girls allowed, "No, it's appreciated. You can distract bullies for us any time you want." She suddenly realized I was wearing Gryffindor robes and asked, "Who are you?" "Harry Dresden, new transfer student. I'm rooming with Percy and Wood." "I haven't actually met Wood yet, but the twins said he might be sitting with you three." I'm Angelina Johnson. This is Alicia Spinnet, and she's Katie Bell. I nodded, trying to remember the names. I think Oliver said he was getting a compartment toward the back of the train. We didn't want to talk Quidditch strategy for all 9 hours of the trip, which we would if we were sharing a compartment with Oliver. She realized how that sounded and explained, he's very nice. But it's hard to get him to talk about anything but Quidditch, especially if you're on the team. I'll take my chances, I guess. Sad that the twins sent me in exactly the wrong direction, but I guess it worked out. See you ladies at school. I nodded and set out. Behind me, Alicia muttered, "That's weird. They're usually spot on when you ask them where someone is." I wove my way back down the train and found the twins again in their car. A little dark-haired boy was in with them asking, "You haven't seen Trevor, have you?" "Your Toad?" asked one of the twins. "No, sorry, Neville. No worries. He'll turn up eventually. Gives me an excuse to meet people at least," the boy admitted. Speaking of which, without missing a beat, he turned to me, sized me up, and gave a little bow that somehow didn't come off completely pretentious. "Neville Longbottom, pleased to make your acquaintance." "Harry Dresden," I acknowledged, still amused at how tiny the first years were. Since that didn't appear to be quite enough social nicety, I asked, "What house are you hoping for?" The twins chuckled, and one explained, "If Neville doesn't get Gryffindor, his family is going to go spare." "Not as bad as if Ron doesn't get it," Neville demurred. "I think they're half expecting Hufflepuff, though, so I have a fallback." He shrugged. "Well, needs must with more toad-assisted glad-handing." "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Dresden." He nodded and continued back up the train, poking his head into the next car and asking, "Excuse me, have you seen a toad?" "Cute kid," I said, then noted, "Girls say Woods the other way. They didn't want to talk about Quidditch for 9 hours." "Interesting," one considered. "Usually younger kids to the back," the other explained. "Let's go check it out," the first continued. "I don't want to talk about Quidditch for 9 hours either," the girl, Patricia, admitted. "I think I'll go find Alicia and Angelina." "You coming, mate?" they asked Lee. 9 hours of Quidditch or compartment of girls all to myself, their friend pretended to consider. "You have fun looking for Wood." Everyone else had been using my roommate's name normally, but for Lee it was clearly a euphemism. He and Patricia then headed out. Heading toward the back of the train, it wasn't long before we bumped into a lady with a snack cart, leaving no room in the aisle to get by. We all had to awkwardly crush into a random compartment, muttering apologies to the group of older kids whose room we'd invaded. The twins seemed to recognize one of them, a guy that looked a little bit like a bulldog, and the first said, "Oh, hey, Tin Whistle. We never got a response from you about that proposal we sent." "Could be great together," said the other, trying to sweeten whatever deal they were referencing. "I'll think about it, now get out of my car," the boy they were talking to grumbled in a Cockney accent. We squeezed around the snack lady's cart and continued. As we walked, they felt the need to explain what I'd seen. Tin Whistle is an amazing conjurer. Barely scraped by on his other owls, but if you need something created from nothing, he's your guy. We're hoping to get him involved in pranking this year. But he doesn't take us seriously yet. He will, though. Finally, they seemed to recognize Wood in one of the compartments in the final train car, sitting talking to the youngest Weasley boy, Ron. My other roommate was pretty burly for a 15-year-old, with hair that was nearly buzz-cut, which was interesting with so many other wizards going for longish hair. He was using hand gestures while describing some kind of aerobatic maneuver in a Scottish accent that would put McGonagall's to shame. He caught sight of us through the window and pointed out, "Oi, Fred and George, you left my replacement keeper alone back here." Ron puffed up at that description and then gushed. "We were talking about how Ireland managed a shutout at the last playoffs. Our brother's as nutty about Quidditch as Oliver," a twin told me, Sato voice. "If we'd known they were together, we'd have gone and sat with the girls, too," the other groaned. "Don't you two play Quidditch?" I asked as we slid into the compartment and closed the door behind us. "Sure, but we have an eclectic and varied slate of other interests," the first said louder, trying to get the jocks to cool it. The second took that as his cue to introduce me. "Oliver Wood, Harry Dresden, your roommates now. Transfer student," I explained to Oliver's raised eyebrow. "Fair enough," the Scotsman allowed. "Do you play Quidditch?" I shook my head. "The flying teacher. Moonshine, I think." Everyone but Ron snickered, as I remembered. "No, hooch." Anyway, after I took a placement test, she said I wasn't allowed on a broom again without Madame Pomfrey on standby and everything within sight covered in cushioning charms. Disappointed, Oliver said, "That's a definite no then." He turned to the twins and asked, "Do we have any possibilities for a seventh? I'd rather play Katie as chaser, but she could do seeker if we absolutely can't find anyone better." After what had to be 2 hours of Quidditch talk, I finally thought I had assembled enough context clues to ask a very important question. "So the game doesn't end until the seeker catches this golden ball, and that's worth 150 points. Off of their nods, I asked. Won't that always decide the game unless one team is just drastically better than the other one? Charms on all the balls, Oliver explained, clearly having fielded this question before. They're designed to create a kind of runaway winner effect. The more points you get up, the more the quaffle and bludgers will help your team out. A team that's slightly better will tend to pull away dramatically if they can keep their lead for long enough. And the snitch tries to hide until a team is close to 150 points ahead, so it becomes a last-second race to see if you can get it to keep your team from getting shut out. I think our equipment is broken, though, one of the twins grumbled. That almost never happens at school matches, the other explained. Oliver shrugged. We play with what we have, just like the school brooms. New gear is expensive, and a lot of the budget goes to getting a new snitch for every game. It's good practice for the professional leagues, where it does usually work properly. He was about to launch into an even more technical explanation when Neville showed back up, being led by a tiny girl with bushy brown hair. She asked without formality, "Has anyone seen a toad? Neville's lost one." "We've already told him we haven't seen it," said Ron. "Us too," said one of the twins. Neville just shrugged apologetically as the girl seemed to have noticed the distinctive Weasley hair. "Oh, are you brothers? That must be helpful." Nobody in my family's magic at all. It was ever such a surprise when I got my letter, but I was ever so pleased, of course, I mean. Before she could get going on a sentence that might not ever finish, Neville whispered, "Breathe, Hermione." He then introduced her to the rest of the compartment. "This is Miss Hermione Granger. She's a Muggle-born, but has already read all of her textbooks. She's hoping for Gryffindor too." We introduced ourselves around the compartment, not sure what to think of the high-strung young witch when she had a thought. While it's far too advanced for me, of course, I had read about something called the summoning charm, and that it was taught in fourth year, and I thought that maybe if one of you already had fourth year, it might work to find Trevor. Did that have any full stops? I chuckled at the girl. I looked at Oliver and he shrugged. I looked at Neville and he shrugged. "You said his name was Trevor." "How big is he?" Neville nodded and made a gesture to describe what had to be a hard toad to lose. "What do you think the chances are that he's not on the other end of the train?" He gave me the so-so hand gesture. I gave him a warning look that this was risky. We both looked at how excited Hermione was to see magic. I shrugged, focused on my intention, charged magic into the effect, and said, "Accio, Trevor." I felt something catch hold onto the other end of the magical probe and stuck my hand into the aisle just in case. After a few moments, Ron, curious, stuck his head out into the aisle to look, just precisely in time to get smacked in the face by a flailing, flying, 4-pound frog as it completed its journey into my hand. I handed the distressed, but seemingly whole familiar to Neville as Fred and George laughingly dragged Ron off the floor and back into the compartment. "Did you just do that without a wand?" Hermione nearly shrieked. Only I heard that wandless magic wasn't taught until Newt level, and even then it was extremely difficult to do with advanced spells, and it looked like you didn't even need do the wand gesture. Neville again politely tapped the girl on the arm to get her to breathe, but also seemed impressed. I shrugged. Apparently the way I learned is a lot different than the normal Hogwarts curriculum. I hadn't expected my ride to Hogwarts to be crammed 7 into a compartment explaining magical theory to 2 11-year-olds, while 4 other people alternately talked incessantly about Quidditch and broke into the other conversation when something actually interested them. Oliver seemed like a classic jock, only interested in maintaining good enough grades that he was in no threat of getting disqualified for sports. He did seem competent magically, and admitted he was hoping I would help him study because Percy was hard to follow. Hermione was a tiny magical prodigy waiting to explode into the school. Everyone, particularly his brothers and roommate, planned to force Percy to mentor the awkward little girl that was so much like him in so many ways. We had to keep her from rushing to go get paper to take notes, promising that this was just a conversation, but we'd go over it again for her later. Neville seemed to have had a pretty well-rounded elementary magical education, including a frankly impressive understanding of plants for a first year, but was hopeless when it came to things Muggle. I suggested the pureblood wizards and the Muggle-born witch consider a culture swap. While the boy had a pretty good polite mask, I thought he was secretly thrilled to not be alone on the train. I could relate. Ron seemed like the opposite of Percy. Where the older brother clearly had a lot of coping strategies for the twins' antics and seethed about being picked on, the younger brother just seemed resigned to the abuse. I'd never had brothers, so I couldn't exactly decide how much I'd hate so much attention from a family member, or just appreciate being included in any way. Other than being really interested in Quidditch, which he probably couldn't even play until Oliver graduated if he was sorted Gryffindor, since there wouldn't be a spare position for him to fill. He seemed not to have anything that really excited him. The twins were a lot. It was getting fairly late in the day when the platinum-haired little boy I'd seen at the station walked down the aisle, flanked by two fat boys who might make for intimidating muscle once they finished puberty, and boldly opened the door into our compartment. I thought my Gryffindor count was low, introducing myself down the train. I'm Malfoy, Draco Malfoy. This is Crabbe and Goyle. Pureblood, since this seemed to be a pureblood thing that Neville, at least, had done too, we played along and introduced ourselves to Draco Malfoy and his prepubescent goons around the compartment. He tried not to sneer at the Weasleys and mostly succeeded, and failed when he was introduced to Hermione. I wondered if he was actually trying to control his prejudice, or whether the firsties would have had a much different reception if it had just been them in the compartment, rather than having several much bigger boys in with them. Well, I suspect that none of the three of you are expecting to be in Slytherin with me, so I'll look forward to being rivals with new Gryffindors. For a moment, the tiny aristocrat looked like he wanted to say something to me in particular, but changed his mind, nodded, and headed on his way. What a strange child. Maybe all rich purebloods were this eccentric. That went better than it had any right to, quipped one of the twins when the door was closed again. What's up with that kid? Asked Oliver. His dad's Lucius Malfoy, the other twin supplied. Former Death Eater. Bought his way out, and now owns a bunch of businesses and about half the ministry. Our dad's always trying to bust him, Ron interjected, before the first twin could tag back in. He gave a smug look at his brothers for interrupting them. Why? Why did he sneer at me like that? Asked Hermione. There was a tacit passing of the buck around the compartment about who wanted to break to the girl genius that she was a second-class citizen. Oliver and I, as the oldest, were silently daring each other to take it when Neville stepped up, unprompted. Did you read about the Wizarding War in any of your books? He asked. She thought about it for a second. The recent one. I haven't had a chance to read about it thoroughly yet because our first-year history textbook is pretty high-level about the last few decades, but it was against a Dark Lord that nobody wants to name, right? All nodded, and Neville continued. It wasn't just a war against a Dark Lord. There were a lot of witches and wizards on his side. Most of them were from old wizarding families that wanted. It wasn't that his courage let out, but that he seemed to lack the vocabulary to sum up institutional prejudice succinctly. I barely understood it, but I tried to jump in and help. Wizards live for a long time. There are a lot of them alive that were kids in the Victorian era. They keep to themselves. They've missed all the things science and technology have come up with in the 20th century. They think the non-magical world has nothing to offer the magical one, and they should stay separate. Neville nodded in thanks and picked back up. At some point, around the time my gran was in school, she started to notice that the Muggle-born. He paused long enough to be sure that she knew that meant her, and he didn't have to explain it. Didn't want to start at the bottom and treat the pureblood families as their natural superiors, like they always had before. They wanted to be treated equally. But why wouldn't they want to treat other human beings as equal? Can't Muggle-borns do magic just as well as purebloods? She asked, halfway between anger and fear. None of us had the understanding of the world to explain it to her, But it was actually Ron that saved the day with what would turn out to be an ongoing fixation on food. Well, it's like, you have a birthday party every year, right? With the same kids, and you each get a big slice of cake. And it used to be, if there were any leftovers you didn't want, you maybe give them to the poor kids next door. But then, those kids want to be invited to the party, and they want as much cake as you're getting, not just the scraps. The little witch turned it over in her head, and was smart enough and focused enough on fairness that she eventually figured it you. But it's not really your birthday party, is it? It's Magic's birthday party, and Magic invited all its friends, and you just happen to live in the house where the cake has been showing up the longest. Everyone thought about it, and eventually nodded that her point made sense too. I just pointed out to her, sadly, most wizards aren't as smart as you. They don't even teach philosophy at Hogwarts. Basically, we agree with you that it's stupid, but to let Neville continue the story, just take as given for now that there are some purebloods that resent Muggleborns because they don't want to share. Right, Neville said, picking back up the thread. There was actually a bigger war that had a lot to do with that a long time ago, but defeating Grindelwald didn't solve all the problems. So more recently, when most of our parents were still in school, a new Dark Lord rose up and said he was finally going to take back control of the wizarding world for the purebloods. It was a hard time, Oliver said. I can remember a little at the end of it. It was scary. Even though most of the country was against the Death Eaters, in general, there weren't enough people willing to fight instead of hide, and nobody could figure out how to kill the Dark Lord and end it. Neville continued again. When they finally did beat him, some of the Death Eaters, like Malfoy's father, claimed they were mind-controlled so they wouldn't go to prison. And there are still a lot of purebloods that agreed with them, but just didn't do anything illegal. Hermione looked scared, so I stepped back in. Hermione, most of the purebloods you're going to meet are like Neville and the Weasleys. They don't care that you're Muggle-born. But I'm not going to lie to you and say there aren't going to be assholes out there that do care. And it sucks, because most of them are rich and important. At least one of those racist jerks is an aura that's trying to lock me up for something I'm not guilty of, and I bet he wouldn't be working so hard if I was a pureblood instead of a half-blood. I didn't think I'd made her feel much better, so I tried hard not to ruin this little girl's greatest day ever. By you know what? What? You're going to have to put up with some mean people, and it's going to suck. But you're still one of the rare people in the world. You have magic. It's worth it. That seemed to allay some of her fears, and she nodded, thinking it over. Finally, she smiled, as if thinking about how much she loved magic already. After a minute, she asked, how did they kill the Dark Lord, Hogwarts? A history rather glossed over it. I wasn't really sure either, since I'd been a 6-year-old and in America at the time, but Oliver explained. For some reason, he decided to go after Lily Potter and her family. She was Muggle-born like you, and they said she was the greatest witch of her generation. He killed them all, Lily, her husband, and her baby son. But they nearly defeated him in the battle, and he was gravely wounded. When he retreated to his base, he called his potions master, Severus Snape, to heal him. Severus Snape had one good quality. Lily Potter was his childhood friend, and he loved her. Snape had begged the Dark Lord not to kill her, but he'd done it anyway. Instead of healing potions, Snape brought his most dangerous elixirs and blew up the entire house, with both of them and several other Death Eaters in it. Chapter 5, Stone-Faced 5, Day 1. Chapter text sorting the rest of the trip went uneventfully, and we all disembarked at the train station outside the castle as the sun was setting. Hagrid called out for the first years, so the tiniest 3 of our travel buddies hurried off to follow him. Apparently, first years rode in boats over the lake to get a really impressive first view of the castle. Everyone else rode in carriages, and when we saw them, hitched to dozens of fanged, bat-winged black horses, I declared, "Ha, Hogwarts is effin' metal." "What?" one of the twins asked. I was about to explain what metal meant, but then it hit me that these were the Strals, and they were invisible to anyone that hadn't seen death up close. Most of these students were probably blissfully unaware of the beasts, and thought the carriages were magically powered without horses. I'd been able to see them the first time Justin took us on a field trip, but I remembered that Elaine couldn't see them, and was freaked out when she touched one. She hadn't had a front row seat to being orphaned like I had. Never mind, I demurred. Fortunately for my anxiety, it was 4 to a cot, and the rest of my compartment mates didn't feel the urge to run off, particularly once they saw Lee and the rest of the Quidditch team in their own cart, so I had people to ride up to the castle with. Got into the great hall ahead of the firsties. I'd taken a few meals here over the last month, though it mostly seemed easier for food to get sent up to the Gryffindor common room for me. The floating candles and golden plates were definitely a festive touch over the mostly bare room of the summer. Also, a couple hundred students filing in to sit at the 4 long tables were many times the previous maximum I'd seen in here. It was amazing how filling up a large room could make it feel even larger. Given how there wasn't any food set out, but the sorting hat was prominently on a central stool, I guessed. We don't eat until all 40 of the new kids are sorted, do we? No, but it's usually pretty fast, Oliver answered. Good. They didn't serve anything to eat on the train except sugar. Do they want everyone to stuff themselves and then immediately crash out after dinner? The twins suddenly realized that was probably true and looked betrayed. I wasn't exactly prepared for the hat to sing a song about the houses, but then the kids began to file in. Our table got a handful of students, including one excitable dark-haired boy with a thick Irish accent whose name I thought Dumbledore had mentioned to me previously. Hermione practically flew up to the stool and was almost instantly sorted to our table to great applause. Shortly after that, Neville calmly walked up to the stool, and the hat took a bit longer than it had for Hermione, but still sent him our way. Shortly after, surprising no one, Malfoy went to Slytherin. My stomach really started to grumble down the back half of the alphabet, and I didn't recognize anything about the few other kids that came our way before it was down to Ron and one other boy. Ron was clearly relieved when he was instantly sorted into Gryffindor. Once the last kid got sent to Slytherin, this hunger-intensifying procedure was finally over. While most of the new first years had grouped themselves into the end of the table, Oliver and the twins had made certain there was a spot for Hermione to sit next to Percy, and Ron had boldly shoved his brothers apart to get a spot. We'd probably have made room for Neville, too, but he seemed interested in making connections to his yearmates rather than spending more time with the older kids. Dumbledore stood after the hat was removed, and there was relative silence. He made a weird dad joke about a few words that probably had everyone thinking he was crazy, rather than just not as funny as he thought he was. But since it led to no additional time delay before the food materialized, I was willing to spot him his eccentricities. The food was, indeed, worth waiting 9 hours for, but I almost choked taking a drink of what I thought was orange juice. What the hell is that? I coughed. Hermione tried the juice and got a similar look of confusion on her face. Pumpkin juice, Percy explained. They don't have it in the Muggle world for some reason, but it's good for you. It has all the vitamins growing teenagers need. I'm suspicious of that statement, I said, cautiously smelling, and then retasting the concoction that was like someone pulped an undersweetened pumpkin pie. Is this just for the feast, or every meal, mate? Learn to love it, Oliver grinned. They'd mostly been serving me water over the summer, and I finally spotted a jug of it that I could use to replace this terrifying concoction. It was, however, becoming abundantly clear that I'd have to solve the problem of the total lack of Coke sooner rather than later. I wondered, if I got a case of it, would the elves keep it in the kitchens and send it up for me? Hermione hurried to finish eating, even managing to choke down the pumpkin juice, before she launched into all the new magical theory and class syllabus questions she'd thought up in the half hour since we'd separated on the train platform. Everyone made sure Percy was on the hook for answering them, and he looked vaguely persecuted for the first question before realizing that he actually liked having another information sponge to share with. The rest of the Quidditch team had sat next to the twins and Oliver, so that chunk of the table turned to more sports talk. Percy's fellow prefect, a dark-haired girl who introduced herself as Alexis Marie, asked to swap seats with me so she could get in on that discussion. That finally gave me a minute to meet my other roommates, Chris Horton and Toby Lennox. Chris was a member of a wizarding family that specialized in broom manufacture and Quidditch, and had disappointed Oliver in particular for not being particularly good on a broom. Toby was an Irish Muggle-born who was considering whether he'd continue on to his newts or go back to Muggle education after he got his owls this year. Both seemed like middling students more interested in hanging out with each other and their girlfriends. Also, there were ghosts hanging out, but they seemed to be house mascots, and nobody minded, so I just ignored it. Finally, once everyone seemed to be more or less finished, Dumbledore gave a more substantial speech. The Forbidden Forest was, of course, forbidden, though he made a particular point of implying the Weasley twins were known offenders. I felt bad for Filch, as there was basically no chance of anyone following through on his desire to keep magic out of the hallways. I wondered if anyone actually cared about the Quidditch trials. The houses seemed to be pretty set on who they wanted as it was. The headmaster's pronouncement about avoiding the very painful death on the third floor saw a ripple of confusion pass through the hall. "That is strange," Percy frowned. "I thought he might have told us prefects his reasoning at least." "McGonagall mentioned to me that it was out of bounds when I got here a few weeks ago," I volunteered. "But she didn't say anything about a very painful death. I've seen Hagrid going that way a few times. One time he had a whole dead deer with him." Percy considered and suggested, "Could be a creature they imported for care of magical creatures or defense and want to keep away from the rest of the forest." That seemed reasonable to me and everyone else in earshot, or at least no one had a chance to provide a counter-argument before Dumbledore launched into a completely tuneless joke of a school song. I couldn't wait to be an old, eccentric wizard so I could amuse myself at everyone else's expense like Dumbledore did. After that, it was on to the house tower. I was tagging along with Percy and Alexis as they led the first years, when a collection of walking sticks floated around a corner and then started flying individually at Percy. He narrowly dodged one, groaning Peeves. I wondered why he wasn't shielding, before remembering that most wizards were terrible at making barriers that could repel physical objects. I shook my shield bracelet out of the sleeve of my robe and put up a barrier between the bizarre arsenal and the students. As the sticks bounced harmlessly off my shield, Percy gave me a nod, impressed, and yelled, "Peeves, show yourself." Nothing seemed to happen until several canes had bounced off my shield, and then a tiny, translucent man with dark eyes appeared, holding the sticks. "No fun," he shouted. "Wizard shields are for spells, not for sticks. Zoom." He rushed at my shield, and it caught the sticks with a thrum, but allowed him to pass through. The wood clattered to the ground while he tumbled through the air over everyone, making raspberries all the way before flying around a corner. I dropped my shield, a little winded by handling so many impacts, but tried not to let it show. "You want to watch out for Peeves," Percy explained to everyone. "He will not listen to any of the prefects, or any of the other ghosts except the bloody Baron. Lindquist, a third year over in Ravenclaw, can also manage him somehow." We walked up a few more flights of stairs to the portrait of the woman in the pink silk dress and said, "Here we are. The new password is Caput Draconis." As everyone filed into Gryffindor Tower and off to bed, I suddenly realized that this day wasn't really an aberration. I'd be sharing the castle with hundreds of students for the next several months. I didn't really internalize it until the bedroom I'd had all to myself for a month was full of near strangers. This was going to be a hell of an adjustment. Semantics, they certainly didn't care much for adjustment time at Hogwarts, so before I really even had a chance to meet too many people in my house, we were in bed and then having to get up early for classes. The nightmares had at least woken me up early enough to not have to fight 4 other guys for a shower. But after the summer, I wasn't really prepared to go to class first thing in the morning. Professor Babbling seemed nice. She was a thin Persian woman who nonetheless had one of the rural English accents that I couldn't place. She came off like an academic, which may have been why nearly half the small class was made of Ravenclaws. 2 or 3 members of each of the rest of the houses rounded out the baker's dozen of students. For Gryffindor, it was me, Percy, and a Chinese girl I hadn't met yet. Professor had spent the first part of the class doing a brief review, which was a bit redundant since I'd heard much the same thing at my placement test. It probably helped the others who may not have done much work over the summer. Toward the end of the review, Professor Babbling pulled back up to a higher level and asked, "Why do we use ancient runes for inscribing magic?" A Ravenclaw girl with long, curly, blonde hair and a shiny prefect's badge raised her hand, and the professor called on her. "Ms. Clearwater, because their meaning is no longer changing. They have a fixed meaning for magical purposes," answered the prefect. That got a sharp, small nod from Percy, but apparently I gave a look because the professor asked, "Do you disagree, Mr. Dresden?" "Well, it's not wrong," I started, but since everyone was staring at me now, I couldn't bring myself to back down from pontificating. But I think it has to do more with traditional education. They still only have the meaning the wizard ascribes to them. You use ancient runes because they're more likely to have everyone agree on the meaning. "You have something to add, Mr. Weasley," the professor suggested, clearly seeing that Percy was frowning at me. "Harry just said what Penelope said, only less succinctly," explained the redhead, with a nod to the other prefect. Babbling gave me a look that implicitly challenged me to defend my position. She was either a really good teacher or an unrepentant instigator. I shrugged, cut off a strip of parchment, and wrote out a series of runes. "What does this spell do?" I asked Percy and Penelope. "That's a protection rune, followed by a rune of anticipation, and then fire," considered the blonde. "That's almost always used as a flame trap ward," Percy concurred. "We learned something similar in third year." "What if I told you it was placed by a German hill wizard who never went to school and taught himself runes from nearby historical structures?" I added. They both paused, looked at each other, and Penelope said, "Still a flame ward." Percy concurred. "But he doesn't know the correspondences of the symbols. He just knows the sounds they make. And he's tried to write angst the best he can with the runes he knows. To him, this is a fear spell," I explained. "It can't be a fear spell," Percy snapped. "None of those runes have a correspondence to fear." I tried to explain it in a way that wasn't smug. I really did. "Not for you, because you've been taught they're generally accepted meanings, but they don't actually mean anything. They're just anchors for you to concentrate your intentions into your enchantment. The more certain you are of what they mean, the less concentration it takes to envision the effect you want and lay it into the material you're working on." I shrugged. I bet powerful wizards with good concentration, like Dumbledore, can enchant items without having to lay runes on them to help their concentration, and could even enchant an item counter to what the runes said, just to confuse people. Penelope looked upset. She turned to the professor looking for her to contradict me, but babbling just aloud. "Mr. Dresden is correct." "Then why are we bothering to learn any of these, Professor?" asked the blonde prefect. I could have apparently been making up squiggles and using those to cast, as long as I believed in them hard enough. The professor took pity on me and actually taught her own class for a second. Because what Mr. Dresden said originally was correct. Everyone basically agreed. His example of the uneducated wizard is so rare, I've never seen anything like it. In practice, you and Mr. Weasley would have been correct, though you should have also considered whether the runes made a recognizable word as a second layer of meaning. "Then why does it matter if we were right?" Percy complained. "Because, Mr. Weasley, you can't innovate without a deeper understanding. Wizards and witches can go a long way with just the standard meanings of the runes, but they only describe the most common concepts. There are spells you might want to enchant that, should you only have the traditional understanding, you cannot find a way to convey in runes. You'll have to take a step into improvisation to create them, and so you need to know that's possible." She looked around and saw that everyone seemed to be getting it. 5 points to Gryffindor and 3 points to Ravenclaw for the edifying discussion. Penelope was looking at me in some combination of consideration and shock, while Percy's neck appeared almost as red as his hair. I didn't think earning points was going to go far toward mollifying him. Sure enough, as our next class was a double-length potions lesson with the Slytherins, Percy made no secret of sitting as far from me as he could. He grabbed Alexis, the girls' prefect, at the door as his partner and clearly whispering complaints. That seemed to suit Oliver fine, who waved to me to sit next to him. "Kai said you showed up Percy in runes. You as good in potions," the Quidditch captain muttered to me. "I hope so. You as good at stopping Flint from throwing stuff into our cauldron as you are at stopping Waffles," I replied, glancing at the trollish Slytherin glaring at us from a nearby table. "Quaffles," Oliver corrected. "And yes, you take point on making sure our potions turn out, and I'll play defense against the snakes." "Sounds good to me," I agreed, as Professor Belby swept into the room. The professor was an interesting guy, looking something like if Hamlet were put on by 70s gutter punks. His outfits were inevitably ostentatious velvet frock coats with tight sleeves, and delicate runic embroidery. Whatever enchantments, he had put on his expensive clothes to keep them from being ruined by potion. Fumes did not carry to his person, and his mid-length graying black hair was inevitably greased up in some strange, spiky fashion. He seemed to have an unstoppable nervous tic of running his fingers through his hair, and the potion residue did the rest. Also, his first name was Damocles, and he was a direct descendant of the guy that had invented the statute that Dawlish was using on me, which didn't make me feel great. He sat behind his desk and steepled his fingers, proclaiming, "Fifth year, owl year. You'll have a lot of homework. You'll need to prepare. The curriculum suggests we start with Draft of Peace so you can self-medicate for anxiety. I don't like it. See Madame Pomfrey if you need to be medicated. Instead, we're starting with a review of strengthening solution. It's much more useful. Instructions on the board. Who can tell me why the stirring pattern is indicated?" Percy's hand shot in the air, anxious to show me up. This was going to be a long day. Unforgivable, you're fighting with Percy. One of the twins asked, sitting down next to Oliver and across from me at the lunch table. I decided to assume the first one to begin a new conversation was Fred. "How'd you pull that off?" asked George, sitting down next to me and across from his brother. He's usually pretty afraid of confrontation. "Well, I mean Percy's fighting by sitting across the room and glaring, so pretty non-confrontational," elaborated Oliver. "Why is this news?" I asked, trying to make a sandwich. "And how did you find out so quickly?" "Sources," said Fred, as if that explained everything. I raised an eyebrow at Oliver and he shook his head. So I just stared at George until he added, "The Slytherin girls in your runes class must have told their common room after class. The Slytherin guys on the Quidditch team hassled us about it on the way to lunch." "Why would the Quidditch team bother you about me and Percy having a disagreement?" I asked, genuinely confused. Both shrugged, and Fred said, "Trying to sow discord among our house, maybe." George considered, "Maybe they think we'll try to defend our brother and make it easier for them to get back at you." "But he was probably being a ponce," Fred allowed, cheerfully. "So what did he do?" George asked. "Got mad at me for answering the professor's question more thoroughly than he and his friend had, basically," I explained then, after a second, admitted. "I guess I did kind of trick him into getting the wrong answer on a thought experiment in front of the class." "That would definitely do it," Oliver nodded. "Our Percy doesn't like to be wrong." "Then he should probably learn more about the material than what's written in the textbook," I groused. "Ooh," Fred grinned. "Percy the Ponce is no longer the smartest Gryffindor in his year. His quest to be the swotty Weasley has ended before it had even begun," Mark lamented George. "What did Percy do now?" asked Ron, just arriving. Listening to the three younger Weasleys spend the rest of lunch tearing down their brother wasn't as vindicating as I'd expected. Oliver was happy to chime in from time to time, mostly about pretty minor issues, with him being an aloof roommate for several years. While a lot of their complaints were exaggerations, the undercurrent was mostly that Percy had a hard time standing out in a family with 7 children, and that they teased and pranked him mercilessly for it for a decade. I kept half an eye on Percy at the other end of the table, where I thought I saw him periodically sneak glances our way. He didn't really look mad at me, as much as he looked sad. It was still bugging me all throughout history class after lunch, which was just as boring as I expected, but the rest of the afternoon was double-length defense class, and Quirrell threw another distracting curve at me first thing. "Since it's owl year, and I am aware your DD defense instruction has been uneven, we will CC concentrate this year on areas of the exams that have been missed previously. PP perhaps most significant, CC curses." The purple-turbaned professor gazed across the class of Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs and asked, "Who knows the 3 most notorious of such spells, the Unforgivables?" As expected in a class of kids that were old enough at the end of the war to have foggy memories of it, we didn't have much difficulty filling the board with the Imperious, Cruciatus, and Killing curses. They were dutifully added to the top of the chalkboard. Thankfully, demonstrations were not forthcoming. "Who knows some other CC curses that are not unforgivable?" the professor asked, clearly going somewhere with this. Perhaps a bit more slowly in a class of people not inclined to use darker spells, the lower part of the board filled up with curses. I didn't add anything, because I didn't trust where Quirrell was going with this, or how he looked at me. This is a large list. Quirrell gestured at the board. Cece, can anyone tell me, why are these three unforgivable? Perhaps still stinging from this morning, Percy didn't raise his hand, even though he clearly thought he knew the answer. Finally, Rose Wax, one of the girls in my house, raised her hand, and after Quirrell pointed at her, answered, because they carry an automatic sentence to Azkaban if you're caught using them, while the others involve a trial. That statement is true, Quirrell allowed. BB, but not what I was asking for. Why do these three spells CC carry such an automatic sentence? What makes them DD different from, say, the B-Body B-Bind CC curse? The class thought for a moment, and a Hufflepuff boy ventured, they don't have any purpose other than to hurt or kill the target, while the others can be used for legitimate purposes. Quirrell pointed at another curse on the board. What is, then, the legitimate purpose of the Entrell-expelling CC curse? A Hufflepuff girl ventured. Has that one just not been added to the law yet? Mr. Weasley, called the professor. When was the Entrell-expelling C curse C created? The professor was obviously familiar with Percy, because on the spot he explained in great detail that it was created by Urquhart Racaro, who lived in the 1600s. So it had been in use for up to a century before the Unforgivables were classified that way in 1717. That is, of C-course, CC correct. 3 P-points Tita GG Gryffindor. Mr. D. Dresden, I suspect you have an answer. The jerk sprung the trap on me. I sighed and answered, you can't stop them with a shield. Indeed, thank you, Mr. D. Dresden. Another 3 P-points Tita G Gryffindor, Quirrell acknowledged, as he wrote can't shield on the board under the 3 curses. Mr. D. Dresden P presents an interesting opportunity for our C-class. You have PP perhaps noticed that he doesn't CC carry a wand. I'd been carrying my newly carved oak staff to classes all day, so it was probably pretty common knowledge by now. Would you care to explain your style in a historical C context? My urge to make things harder for whatever Quirrell was planning to surprise me with wound up at odds with my love of talking about my magic. So I gave in and explained. Most historical wizards probably used a staff rather than a wand, with other focus items to cast any spells that wouldn't work with the staff. Wand only became popular in the last few hundred years. It's similar to how rapiers replaced swords and armor. Extremely similar, acknowledged Quirrell. As I taught some of you in Muggle studies, as Muggles became more CC cosmopolitan, they switched Tita weapons easier Tita CC carry in a city. Similarly, with the lead-up to the Statute of Secrecy, wizards and witches needed a versatile focus that would be easy to hide from Muggles. You have a concern, Mr. Weasley. Surprised to be called out for the expression he was making, Percy explained, I thought the Muggles stopped using armor not because it was impolite in a city, but because it was no longer very effective against crossbows and firearms. 5 PP points Tita GG Gryffindor, Quirrell said, giving the closest thing to a smile of appreciation I'd seen from him. I thought we'd have to see come Tita that the long way around. He's CC correct. Just as firearms made a knight's armor obsolete, the unforgivable CC curses drove wizards' Tita styles that emphasized mobility, so they could dodge these spells instead of trying Tita shield against them. And just as the Muggles are looking to ban firearms, wizards ban these CC curses. The Muggles are only about 3 centuries behind us. Oliver raised a hand and was acknowledged, asking, but if we ban the unforgivables, why don't more people use Harry's style? Quirrell shrugged. The exact reasons may be lost to history, but likely because the P process had already started. Wands are easier to hide and more CC convenient to carry. They became easier to make as woodworking TT technology and spells improved. But PP perhaps Mr. D. Dresden would like to demonstrate for us why his style still has holdouts. There it went. He put me front and center, so I couldn't refuse without looking like a coward. You want me to put up a shield and see how strong it is? I asked. Indeed, but we'll also need a CC control, who has a strong shield charm. The boy with the Hufflepuff prefect badge reluctantly raised a hand, after all his classmates clearly wanted him to get credit for it. Mr. Flinton, yes. Excellent. Let's have the 3 other PP prefects on a fence. He positioned a suddenly worried Flinton on one side of the front of the classroom, and Percy, Alexis, and the girl Hufflepuff prefect on the other side. Now, Mr. Flinton will shield, and you three will use strong stunners. Stop as soon as his shield falls. Ready, begin. Flinton's protego looked solid, but it started to flicker after the first barrage of 3 shouts of stupefy and fell to the second with Percy's punching through. Flinton narrowly dodged out of the way. An excellent showing. 3 PP points to Hufflepuff. Mr. Dresden, if you'd replace Mr. Flinton. I grimaced and slouched to the front of the room as the clearly winded prefect sat back down. Same rules. Begin. I shook my shield bracelet out of the sleeve of my robe and focused my will on generating a protego with it. I could get it to produce more versatile shields, but the basic one would be more efficient. I noticed most of the class look shocked both at how I was producing it and how it was larger than Flinton's, providing total coverage from the ground to above my head. The other 3 prefects started flinging stunners, and they splashed onto my shield without much issue. After the first salvo, I made some subtle adjustments to the shape of my shield so more of the energy got diverted into the ground. By the third salvo, I could tell that Percy in particular was putting a lot of power into his stunners, trying to break through. I was definitely getting tired, but I was too stubborn to tap out before I passed out. I was curious whether I could keep this up longer than they could. After the 6th salvo, when it was clear just how much longer I'd be able to shield than Flinton, Quirrell suggested, Mr. D. Dresden, show them why you're using the B bracelet and not your staff. I smirked, finally feeling like the guy was letting me in on the joke, and flung my own stunner around the edge of my shield without dropping it. It wasn't very powerful, because that's not what my staff was optimized for, and my aim was off due to having to go around my own shield. But I was pleased that Alexis had to break off her own next stunner to shield against mine. Stop, the professor insisted. That is an excellent demonstration. The 3 stopped firing, and I lowered my shield with a tired sigh a moment later. As you can see, Tita Cece, continue the analogy, it's the difference between attacking another unarmored swordfighter and attacking a knight in peaplate armor and a shield. You may wonder, then, why we don't all learn to fight this way. If the unforgivables are no longer a factor, and focus making has evolved like his BB bracelet, so its CC can be easily C-carried and C-concealed, why do we teach you Tita shield with a wand? The professor looked around for an answer as I ambled back to my seat, only to hear him answer his own question. Because wands are fast. Stupefy. I finally realized where the real trap was too late, and my shield did indeed take a little longer to put up than a wanded charm. I only had it half raised before the professor's stunner knocked me out. This was only my second run-in with the guy, and I was already starting to hate him. Fortunately, Oliver was as good at catching unconscious bodies as he was Quaffles, so I didn't split my head open collapsing against a desk. Quickly revived, I didn't have to be the guinea pig for the rest of the lesson, as Quirrell expanded on the functions and defenses against various other curses. But I sometimes caught glances from him, as if he was thinking about what torture to inflict on me next. What had I done to this guy? While defense class was a nice distraction, I returned to my earlier conundrum when I overheard Ron Weasley complaining to the twins on the way into dinner, pantomiming an exaggerated raised hand gesture, trying to grab something off the ceiling. Was Percy that bad when he was a first year? I'd never had siblings, and in a lot of ways I envied the support network that the Weasley boys had. But I could see it from Percy's point of view as well. They seemed to be a family that loved sports, adventures, and pranks. If you were someone who didn't, there was probably no escape at home. I'd only had to share the tower with a bunch of Gryffindors for one night so far, and I was already planning places in the castle I could hide to be by myself. What if you were just in a family house, putting up with that for years with nowhere to go? After dinner, I made a point of organizing my trunk in our bedroom, hoping to catch Percy in private. Fortunately, he stopped by, probably planning to grab some things and run to the library. He eyed me warily as he went to get books from his own trunk. Those were some good stunners today, I told him, as nonchalantly as I could manage. I don't think I could have kept my shield up much longer. He considered a moment, kneeling and faced away from me as he sorted, then just said, it was a team effort. The girls are strong casters as well. Probably, I nodded, but I could definitely tell the difference when yours hit. And yet, he grumbled. Your shield held. Like the professor said, it's just a question of styles, I explained. If you gave me a wand, I wouldn't be able to even do as good a job as that Hufflepuff prefect did. This bracelet is purpose-built for shields, and so it's more effective than a wand, which can cast anything. I considered for a moment, and I had to make it myself, which gave me more insight into how enchantment works than looks like you would have covered yet in the Hogwarts curriculum. He stood up again, books forgotten, and regarded me. I wager you will have a similar story for how you just happened to get an O in each of your owls while befriending the Quidditch team, out-dueling a few seventh years, and casually having time to tutor the first years. Definitely not astronomy and history, I demurred. They wanted to put me in with the first years on both of those. I just do not understand you, Harry, Percy whined. You have auras claiming that you are a murderer, but the headmaster and our head of house bending over backwards to help you fit in. You seem to be Muggle-born, yet somehow know more about runes and defense than anyone but the professors. He clenched his fist, and somehow, when you go off on a rant about how magic works that has the professor thanking you for educating the class, everyone thinks that makes you cool. I'm going to come back to how you seem to think Muggle-born means that I should be incompetent, I said, having nearly interrupted him there. But can I make an observation? I'm not trying to be cool. I'm honestly barely holding myself together, so I don't have time to worry about what other people think about me. I'm just happy your brothers haven't yet gotten everyone thinking I'm a murderer. What I do care about is being nice to people. I'm basically trapped in this castle until I turn 17, and maybe longer if Dawlish decides to keep riding me. I have to make enough friends to not go crazy with people hating me. I mean, I can't even begin to understand Quidditch, but I listen politely because that's what Oliver and your brothers want to talk about. Maybe they'll decide they hate me next week. What I can't figure out is why you seem so happy with them not liking you. Percy looked like he wanted to fight about it, then flung himself petulantly onto his bed, sitting to face me as he answered, You think I never tried to make people like me? I spent years helping Oliver study, but it took a day for you to be his favorite lab partner. I was excited to get to be a prefect, sure, because it was recognition, but also so I could help the lower years. Ron already has them ignoring me. I mean, I don't want to pretend I'm an expert or anything, since I'm pretty much just a giant magical nerd, I admitted. But have you tried to make friends with anyone non-academically? I mean, I also don't get why they're so excited about sports, instead of literally rewriting the known laws of reality with a flick of their wrists. But for some reason, they really want to talk about Quidditch, and don't mind if you just let them talk about Quidditch. I just cannot bring myself to pretend to care. He slumped down on his bed. I get the thrill of flying. I find exploding snap and gobstones momentarily amusing. I can certainly appreciate music as a distraction or background noise. But when people only want to spend time doing those things in the best years we have to become experts at, as you say, rewriting the laws of reality, it just seems so childish. He nodded, granting me the point. Percy, I get it. I had to grow up really early, for reasons I wouldn't wish on anyone else, and if I'm being honest, I can be pretty childish sometimes too. I can't presume too much about your parents or older brothers, but I bet even if they were helping, you had to grow up fast just to counterbalance the twins. Ron and Ginny are quite immune to reason and sense as well, on most days, he added. They're at least still preteens. Hopefully they'll grow out of it. But my point being, you're all still young. It's okay to just be a kid sometimes. What are you afraid is going to happen if you take a break, maybe aren't best in the class at something, and find a hobby that's just something you do for fun? He sighed and thought for a moment, then said, Forgive me for saying, you would never understand, when I expect that you would love to have more family, but you would never understand. My eldest brother is a world-traveling curse-breaker. He is in Egypt, exploring old tombs. The next brother just graduated and is off in Romania working at a dragon sanctuary. While here, both of them were excellent students, and Charles was the greatest seeker the Quidditch team had in years. Then there are the twins. They are toweringly childish and annoying, but they are secretly brilliant enchanters, good at sports, and everyone seems to love them. Finally, Ginny is the first Weasley daughter in generations, the girl my parents were willing to have son after son to try to get, then stopped having children. And you're stuck in the middle of all that with no way to stand out, I said. He nodded. What about Ron? I am actually really worried about our Ronald, Percy admitted. He has little hope of playing Quidditch until Oliver graduates, and that seems to be all he cares about. While he is surprisingly brilliant at chess, that never seems to inform any of his other choices. I worry he will be miserable here eventually. By this point, I'd also leaned back on my bed, and after the initial confrontational stance, we were having the kind of relaxed roommates conversation I'd sometimes had with Elaine. I thought about it, and then asked, "What do you want to do with your life, Percy?" Assuming I can achieve the requisite scores on my owls, and then on my newts, I should be able to enter the ministry at a middle grade, and then rise through the ranks over several years. Law enforcement, healer, diplomat, I asked. Whichever department has an opening, I suppose. My father thinks that there might be an opening in the Department of International Magical Cooperation soon, where I could take charge of updating the British standards and regulations to the European level. We really do allow shoddy craftsmanship on things like cauldrons. I was speechless long enough to let him ramble on to even more mind-numbing fixation on bureaucracy. Finally, I had to interrupt him. Maybe you're passionate about this, and if so, tell me to shut the hell up. But are you really going to become one of the greatest wizards this school has produced this generation, and then act like you're excited to work as an undersecretary in an office? Well, it is quite a secure position. For all that we had to watch our spending, my father is relatively low level within the ministry and is able to support a family with 7 children on his salary alone. And once you begin to rise in the hierarchy, absent major scandals, you have a guaranteed paycheck for life. You're being too adult about things again, man, I insisted. Thought experiment time. Through some magical accident in 7th year charms class, right after you get all arse in your newts, you get thrown into a parallel Earth with no way back. Your family is safe, but you'll never see them again, and they'll never know what happened to you. The only asset you have is your brain and your wand, with nobody having any expectations of you one way or the other. What do you want to do with your life? Well, I mean, allowing that admittedly nigh impossible scenario for the purposes of this thought experiment, the very existence of a parallel universe reachable by magic would seem to call into question several of the known magical laws, particularly elements of Gamp's laws. Assuming I could work in a laboratory with sufficient funding, just trying to unravel what happened to me would be a feat worthy of a lifetime. I clapped and said, "Congratulations. That is a real, honest answer." Doesn't the ministry have a department designed to do exactly that kind of thing? Why aren't you angling to work there? The Department of Mysteries does not publish their guidelines for admittance, so it has always seemed safer to me to pursue a more opportunistic strategy as it comes to job placement, he admitted. Are you making stuff? I asked, remembering that he hadn't seemed to understand why I'd want extra potion supplies for my own creations. Are you doing any independent research projects? Are you investigating any of the existing magical theories and trying to see if you can open up new possibilities? With what time? He asked rhetorically. I have 3 electives as classes and am independently studying the other 2, prefect duties, and study for owl year. I honestly worry if I can find time to get enough sleep. I scoffed. You've certainly planned out your life for a nervous breakdown and an early grave. I assume you're also in arithmancy. What's the other elective you're going to class for? Muggle studies, he admitted with a scowl. That look means you know it's worthless. If you really want the owl, I'll teach you. We can do field trips. You'll learn more in 5 minutes walking around London than in a month of the class. Plus divination, independent study can't be that much of your time. And I'll help you study for owls, because I probably need you to help me anyway. Why are you so interested in my career and emotional well-being, Harry? I had to think about it for a second. Why was I so interested? I'd come in here just trying to diffuse whatever he was mad at me about. Was it that I suddenly saw someone that would be so easy for me to save from his own dumb choices? Maybe it was that I'd spent one day here and already realized that, in a school full of people that could do freaking magic, the awesome power of wizardry was treated as just another boring school subject to skive off of to go play sports, and Percy was one of the few that took it seriously. Maybe I did feel a little guilty for showing up and stealing what little thunder the guy had in our first class together. What I said was, I don't know, really, man. It's just, I think you have it in you to be a magical badass, and I don't like that your brothers don't even see it, and you're going to squander it all to be a bureaucrat. He looked at me for a few seconds, as if to figure out if I was messing with him, but he eventually said, fair enough. I will certainly consider it. He was quiet for a few more seconds. I am still angry at you for making me look stupid in front of Penelope. Oh, suddenly it all made sense. He was trying to show off for the girl. I grinned. Percy, this is great. Aren't Ravenclaws supposed to be the genius researchers around here? Imagine how much you'll be able to show off for her when you let her in on your thrilling extracurricular research project.